My name is Clara, 34 years old, and until that Tuesday morning I thought I had a solid marriage. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your trust shattered by the person you loved most. The morning started like any other in our upscale Seattle suburb. My husband Trent, a vice president at a major tech firm, kissed my forehead and told me he had a late board meeting. I drove downtown to the office of Mr. Harrington, the attorney handling the estate of my late grandfather. He was a self-made man who saw through the arrogant facade of my husband from day one, warning me that Trent cared more about appearances than genuine connection. Mr. Harrington slid a thick leather-bound folder across his pristine desk. "Your grandfather established an irrevocable trust for you, Clara," he said, adjusting his glasses. "The total liquid assets amount to exactly $50 million. My breath caught in my throat. $50 million. It was a staggering sum. I immediately thought of Trent, of how this money could pay off our heavy mortgage, clear his debts, and finally earn me some respect from his status-obsessed mother Beatrice. She never missed a chance to remind me that my government job was an embarrassment to their family image. Let us get these funds transferred to your primary accounts." Mr. Harrington continued typing methodically. He paused, his brow furrowing as he stared at the screen. He clicked his mouse a few times, leaning closer to the monitor. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a confused whisper, "I cannot transfer these funds to your joint marital account. According to the Washington State Judicial Portal, your marriage was legally dissolved 3 months ago." The room started to spin. Divorced. The word echoed in the quiet office, completely detached from reality. I asked him to repeat himself, sure I had misheard. "You and Trent have been legally divorced since August," Mr. Harrington stated, turning the laptop so I could see the official state seal on the digital document. "It says here you waived your right to a hearing and signed a collaborative dissolution agreement." I stared at the screen. There was my name digitally signed and time-stamped. But I had never seen this document. Trent and I spent our anniversary in September dining at a 5-star restaurant. We hosted his family for Thanksgiving just last month. He had been sharing my bed and living in my house as a legally single man, letting me believe I was still his wife. Most people would have broken down in tears. I felt the sharp sting of betrayal, the physical ache in my chest, but panic did not take over. Trent and Beatrice always laughed at my career, calling me an unglamorous data entry clerk. They were fools. I am a cyber forensics auditor. I track missing millions through encrypted networks for federal agencies. Finding digital ghosts is what I do best. "May I use your computer for a moment?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Mr. Harrington slid the laptop toward me. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I bypassed the standard public viewing portal and accessed the back-end metadata of the court filing system, tracing the exact origin of the digital signature. Every electronic document carries a fingerprint, an IP address, that marks precisely where and when it was uploaded. Within 60 seconds, the coordinates appeared on the screen. The IP address did not belong to a courthouse or a public library. It traced directly to a private, highly secure network located in a high-rise building just 3 blocks away. It was the exact network registered to the corporate law firm of Jamal, my African-American brother-in-law. Jamal is married to the sister of Trent. He is a razor-sharp, ruthless attorney who acts as the designated legal cleaner for their messes. Whenever Trent got into trouble, Jamal made it disappear. Suddenly, the entire picture snapped into terrifying focus. Trent had not just forged my signature, he used his brother-in-law to illegally file the documents through a secure legal channel, bypassing the verification processes that would have alerted me. They orchestrated this together, stripping me of my marital rights right under my nose. The audacity of their crime was almost impressive, but their fatal mistake was underestimating me. Mr. Harrington watched me with wide eyes as I pushed the laptop back toward him. "I need you to create a completely isolated, anonymous blind trust," I instructed, standing up and smoothing my skirt. "Transfer the entire $50 million there immediately. Make sure it is legally untouchable and completely invisible to anyone running a financial background check on me." He nodded quickly, recognizing the urgency in my tone. "Consider it done, Clara. Are you going to be all right? I am going to be perfect, I replied, walking out of the office. I drove toward our affluent suburb, my mind racing with legal codes. The pain of betrayal was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating fury. But as I turned onto my street, my plan hit a wall of confusion. My driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. An arch of pastel balloons decorated my porch, and a catering van sat near the garage. I walked toward my house, bass vibrating through the windows. Trent claimed he had a board meeting. Instead, he threw an extravagant party. I reached for the doorknob, ready for war. I pushed the heavy oak door open, and an immediate wall of sound hit me. Laughter and upbeat jazz music filled the entryway. My foyer, the one I had painstakingly tiled by hand, was transformed into an opulent wonderland of white and gold floral arrangements. This was not a board meeting. This was a celebration happening inside the home I technically still paid the property taxes on. I stepped into the living room and froze. A massive banner hung over the fireplace mantel reading, "Welcome, Baby Blackwood." Sitting on a velvet throne right in the center of the room was Sienna Trent's 25-year-old assistant. Today, she was draped in a flowing silk maternity gown, clutching a pregnant belly that was clearly several months along. Before I could even speak, a sharp hand gripped my elbow. "What on earth are you doing here?" Beatrice hissed. My mother-in-law stood blocking my path, her designer jewelry catching the chandelier light. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure revulsion, her eyes lingering on my sensible flats. "I told Trent to have the locks changed yesterday. You are going to ruin Sienna's special day, looking like a displaced civil servant." I pulled my arm away. "I live here, Beatrice. Did you forget whose salary paid the down payment?" Beatrice let out a harsh laugh. "Please, Clara. You push papers for the government. Trent is a vice president now. He is building real wealth. Sienna is giving us the heir this family deserves. You should have packed your things and left with whatever dignity you had remaining." The music seemed to fade as the tension in the room spiked. Then Trent appeared. He emerged from the crowd holding 2 glasses of champagne, wearing a custom-tailored suit. He stopped dead when he saw me, his confident smile morphing into a mask of arrogant pity. "Clara, we discussed this. You were supposed to be out of the house by noon." "We discussed absolutely nothing, Trent," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously level. "I just came from Mr. Harrington's office. Imagine my surprise when I went to claim my grandfather's trust, only to discover a fraudulent divorce decree filed in my name." Trent sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I was doing you a favor." He bypassed the mandatory waiting periods. "We both know you cannot afford a prolonged legal battle on your auditor's salary. I saved you thousands in legal fees, Clara. Sienna and I are building a family now. You need to accept reality." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded check. He pressed it into my hand. "There is $10,000, Trent said, his voice dripping with fake generosity. "That is more than fair for your half of the furniture. Take it, pack a bag quietly, and check into a nice hotel. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. You do not want to fight my family's lawyers." I looked down at the check. $10,000. He thought he could buy my silence and my home for $10,000, all while utilizing Jamal to commit federal wire fraud. He truly believed I was just a helpless data entry clerk who would cower at the threat of his legal team. He had no idea what a cyber forensics auditor did. He had no idea that my federal clearance gave me access to systems he could not even comprehend. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw a tantrum. I simply smiled. I held up the check between my index fingers and thumbs. With one swift, deliberate motion, I tore the paper perfectly down the middle. Trent's jaw tightened. I placed the 2 pieces together and tore them again, reducing his hush money to useless scraps. I stepped forward and dropped the torn pieces directly into Trent's champagne glass. "Keep your money, Trent," I said calmly. "You are going to need every single penny to pay your defense attorney." Before he could process my words, I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was time to give him a brief education on what I actually did for a living. Trent's company utilized a top-tier cybersecurity firm to manage their executive financial accounts and corporate credit lines. What Trent did not know was that my federal agency regularly audited that exact security firm to ensure compliance. I possessed high-level administrative access to their entire back-end portal. I unlocked my screen and opened the secure application. I typed Trent's employee identification number into the search bar. His profile populated on my screen, detailing his massive corporate expense accounts, his executive travel cards, and the slush fund he used to entertain clients. "What are you doing?" Clara Trent demanded, stepping closer. "Put the phone away and get out of my house before I call security." I did not look up. I navigated to the Security Protocols tab. I found the master switch for his financial access. The button was bright red, labeled Immediate Asset Freeze under the Fraud Prevention subcategory. I tapped the red button. A confirmation prompt popped up on my screen. I hit confirm. Exactly 3 seconds later, Trent's phone began to vibrate violently in his jacket pocket. He glared at me, pulled out his device, and glanced at the screen. The arrogant annoyance on his face vanished in an instant, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. The automated alerts from his company's finance department flooded his screen one after another, indicating that his corporate cards, his travel accounts, and his executive spending privileges had been locked down due to suspected fraudulent activity. His eyes darted from his phone to me, his breathing suddenly shallow. "Did you really think Jamal's forged signature was the smartest trick in the room?" I asked, my voice slicing through the party music. "Enjoy the baby shower, Trent. Tomorrow we discuss the federal penalties for wire fraud." Before Trent could formulate a response, a man in a crisp white chef coat pushed through the pastel-clad guests. It was the head caterer from Le Petit Chateau. He looked directly at Sienna. "Excuse me, miss, but the terminal is rejecting the final payment for the caviar and champagne service. It is a balance of $15,000. Sienna scoffed, pulling a metal corporate card from her clutch, the same card tied to Trent's newly frozen accounts. "Just run it again," she demanded. "The machine is probably broken." The caterer inserted the card into his wireless terminal and waited. A loud, sharp beep echoed through the silent living room. "Declined," he stated flatly. He tried another card Sienna thrust at him. Declined again. Whispers erupted among the guests. Beatrice's face flushed a mottled red. Her country club friends were already pulling out their phones to text their group chats. Beatrice snatched the terminal from the caterer and frantically tried her own card, the one Trent paid the bill for every month. The same sharp beep filled the room. Declined. Beatrice looked as though she might faint. "Clara," she shrieked, "fix this immediately. Stop this petty tantrum before you ruin us in front of the entire neighborhood." "I did not touch your card, Beatrice," I replied evenly. "I simply stopped Trent from using company money to fund his personal playground." Trent threw his champagne glass onto a side table, shattering the crystal. "You hacked my accounts," he roared, stepping into my personal space. "I will have you thrown in federal prison for this, Clara. You are a low-level government employee playing games with a multi-billion-dollar tech firm. You have no idea the hell I will rain down on you." His outburst only fueled the gossip. The guests were practically sprinting toward the front door, eager to escape the implosion of the Blackwood family. Within minutes, the lavish baby shower completely emptied out, leaving my hostile in-laws glaring at me in the center of the living room. That is when Jamal stepped forward. He moved with the quiet, predatory grace of a man who destroyed lives for a living. He adjusted his bespoke suit, his dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute disdain. "Let us dial down the theatrics," Clara Jamal said smoothly. "What you just did falls under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Unauthorized access to a corporate network is a federal offense. I can have police here in 5 minutes to escort you off the premises in handcuffs. You will lose your clearance, your job, and your freedom. Now unlock the accounts, take the $10,000, and walk out that door before I destroy your life." He crossed his arms, expecting me to shrink away. He was used to bullying terrified witnesses and crushing small businesses under endless litigation. I let out a genuine, relaxed laugh. It echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the empty room. "You cannot escort me off my own property, Jamal. I said, walking toward the fireplace. Trent scoffed loudly. Are you delusional? My name is on the deed, Clara. I paid the mortgage every month. You just bought the groceries. You paid the mortgage to a private holding company called Apex Guardian. I corrected him, turning to face them. You thought Apex Guardian was an anonymous investment firm. It is not. It is a shell company. I established it 6 years ago. I own 100% of the shares. I bought this house in cash before we ever got married, Trent. I just let you pay me rent every month so you could feel like the big successful provider you so desperately pretend to be. Legally, you are just a tenant, and your lease expired the second you forged our divorce. Jamal uncrossed his arms, his confident posture slipping for the first time. He was a corporate lawyer. He knew what a shell company structure meant, and he knew I had him boxed in. This is a bluff, Beatrice stammered, looking frantically between her son and Jamal. She is lying, Trent. Tell me she is lying. Trent was speechless, his face completely drained of color as the reality of his situation set in. He owned nothing. He had no access to his money, and his pregnant mistress was standing right next to him, realizing her golden ticket had just bounced. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I walked directly up to Jamal and handed it to him. He took it cautiously, his eyes scanning the page. That is a physical printout of the server logs from the state judicial portal, I explained, keeping my tone conversational. It shows the exact date, time, and routing data for the forged digital signature on my divorce papers. I highlighted the IP address for you, Jamal. It matches the dedicated server at your law firm. The exact terminal registered to your personal office. Jamal stopped breathing. The color washed from his face as he stared at the undeniable proof of his crime. Under Title 18, United States Code Section 1343, I continued, my voice sharp and precise. Committing fraud via electronic networks to secure financial gain is wire fraud. It carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in federal prison, and that is before the Bar Association permanently revokes your license to practice law. Sienna let out a sharp gasp, taking a physical step away from Trent. Beatrice covered her mouth, her eyes wide with terror as she looked at her powerful son-in-law, waiting for him to fix this. But Jamal was paralyzed, staring at the paper that held the key to his complete destruction. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your things and permanently vacate my property, I announced, looking at all of them with a steady gaze. If anyone is still inside this house by noon tomorrow, I will hand this document over to the FBI. The fallout from my ultimatum did not take long to materialize. My phone rang at exactly 8 the next morning. It was Jamal. His usual smooth, condescending tone was entirely gone, replaced by a tight-clipped urgency. He demanded I meet him at his downtown law firm immediately. I agreed, knowing exactly what kind of desperate negotiation he was about to attempt. I arrived at the towering glass and steel building 45 minutes later. Jamal's corner office screamed exorbitant wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Seattle harbor, and the furniture was imported Italian leather. He stood behind his massive desk, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed his panic. He had spent the entire night realizing that a federal wire fraud charge would end his career, his freedom, and his marriage to Trent's sister. Have a seat, Clara, Jamal said, gesturing to a chair. I remained standing. I prefer to keep this brief, Jamal. The clock is ticking on your eviction notice. He let out a forced, nervous laugh and leaned against his desk. Look, let us be reasonable adults here. You caught us. I will admit Trent made a reckless decision and I facilitated a shortcut. It was a lapse in judgment. But going to the FBI destroys my law license and ruins Trent. Nobody wins if you push the nuclear button. I am prepared to offer you a highly lucrative alternative. He slid a sleek black folder across the desk. Inside was a cashier's check made out to me for $100,000, along with a thick non-disclosure agreement. $100,000, Jamal said, his voice dropping into his polished courtroom cadence. Tax-free. You sign the NDA, you keep quiet about the origin of the divorce filing, and you walk away. With that money plus your little government salary, you can start fresh anywhere you want. It is a clean break. I stared at the check, then looked up at him. You really think my silence is worth 100 grand? It is a generous offer, Clara. Do not let spite blind you to a good business deal. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a manila envelope. I dropped it directly on top of his non-disclosure agreement. I do not need your $100,000, Jamal, I said, my voice ice cold. Because I already know about the $3.2 million Trent stole from his own company. Jamal physically recoiled. His hand shot back from the desk as if the envelope had burned him. What are you talking about? He stammered, all pretense of control vanishing. I opened the envelope and spread the spreadsheets across his pristine desk. You both thought I just pushed papers for a local tax office. You never bothered to ask what a cyber forensics auditor actually does. I spend my days tracing encrypted financial webs for federal task forces. When I audited Trent's company security portal last night, I did not just freeze his corporate cards. I pulled the entire transaction history of his department for the last 24 months. I pointed to a highlighted column of numbers. Trent has been authorizing dummy vendor invoices, funneling company capital into a phantom marketing agency. And where did that money go? It went straight to paying for Sienna's extravagant influencer lifestyle. The private jet to Tulum, the $50,000 diamond tennis bracelet she flaunted on Instagram last week, the luxury apartment she rented before she decided to move into my house. Trent embezzled millions of dollars to buy himself a 25-year-old trophy. Jamal swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically across the spreadsheets. Clara, Trent's financial mismanagement is a company issue. It has nothing to do with my law firm. I smiled, leaning closer to him. Oh, but it does, Jamal. Trent could not move that kind of capital directly to Sienna without triggering internal banking alerts. He needed a middleman. He needed someone to wash the funds first. I traced the routing numbers from the phantom marketing agency. Every single stolen dollar passed through your law firm's escrow accounts before hitting Sienna's bank. Jamal dropped into his leather chair, the fight completely draining out of him. He was a man who prided himself on finding legal loopholes, on being the smartest guy in the room. He had just realized he was sitting across from someone who could dismantle his entire reality with a few keystrokes. I had him on wire fraud for the forged divorce, and now I had him dead to rights on federal money laundering and conspiracy. You are going to ruin us, Jamal whispered, his voice trembling. I am just holding up a mirror, I replied. You ruined yourselves. The heavy oak door of the office suddenly slammed open. Trent stormed into the room, bypassing the terrified secretary hovering in the hallway. He was wearing a brand new designer suit, looking infuriatingly arrogant and completely unbothered by the fact that he was currently being evicted from my property. Stop negotiating with her, Jamal, Trent barked, glaring at me with absolute contempt. Do not give her a single dime. Trent, shut up, Jamal hissed, standing back up. You have no idea what she has on us. She tracked the escrow accounts. She knows about the money you funneled to Sienna. Trent just rolled his eyes, adjusting his expensive silk tie. So what? Let her cry to whoever she wants. It does not matter anymore. He stepped right up to me, a smug, triumphant grin spreading across his face. You think you hold all the cards because you found some routing numbers. You think freezing my corporate cards changes anything. It changes the fact that you are going to federal prison, I stated calmly. Trent let out a loud, mocking laugh. You are living in a fantasy world, Clara. I am untouchable now. Tonight is the annual shareholder gala. Beatrice and Sienna are already getting their hair done for the red carpet. At 8 o'clock tonight, the board of directors is officially voting to promote me to chief executive officer. He leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive espresso and sheer entitlement. As CEO, I control the narrative. I control the board. I will have a legal team of 50 corporate sharks who will bury your little spreadsheets in so much litigation you will go bankrupt just trying to pay filing fees. I am the future of this company. They will never let a disgruntled, bitter ex-wife take down their new leader. Jamal looked at Trent in horror, realizing his brother-in-law was too blinded by arrogance to understand the danger they were in. You want to play hardball? Clara, Trent sneered, pointing a finger at my chest. Bring it on, because by tomorrow morning, I will have the power to crush you like an insect. He grabbed Jamal's arm. We are leaving. I have a tuxedo to pick up. I watched Trent swagger out of the office, Jamal trailing behind him like a condemned man walking to the gallows. They thought the CEO title was a shield. They had no idea I already owned the sword. The crystal ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel hummed with the sound of clinking glasses and corporate networking. I stood in the shadows near the grand entrance watching the spectacle unfold. Trent was in his element. He stood behind the crystal podium, illuminated by a brilliant spotlight, delivering a grandiose speech about leadership vision and the future of the company. He spoke passionately about integrity, transparency, and family values, words that tasted like ash coming from his mouth. In the front row, Beatrice wiped away a performative tear of pride draped in emerald silk. She whispered excitedly to her country club friends, undoubtedly boasting about her son, the CEO. Beside her, Sienna cradled her pregnant belly, wearing a diamond necklace that Trent had purchased using the very funds he embezzled. They looked like the perfect wealthy family, untouchable and triumphant, completely unaware that their entire reality was about to violently collapse. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored midnight blue suit. It was a far cry from the off-the-rack outfit Beatrice had mocked just 24 hours ago. Behind me stood Mr. Harrington and three of the most ruthless corporate litigators in the Pacific Northwest. I had spent my entire morning transferring my $50 million inheritance into an aggressive blind trust, systematically buying up every available share of Trent's company through private acquisitions. We did not come to this gala to negotiate. We came to conquer. I pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors. The heavy thud echoed across the cavernous ballroom, cutting through the polite applause that followed Trent's speech. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns as my legal team and I marched down the center aisle. I kept my gaze locked dead ahead, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The crowd parted for us like the Red Sea. Trent froze mid-sentence. His arrogant smile dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. He leaned into the microphone, his voice sharp and panicked. Security Trent barked, the sound booming through the massive speakers. Remove this woman immediately. She is a disgruntled former family member and she is trespassing on a private corporate event. Get her out of here now. Two burly security guards in dark suits moved toward me from the perimeter of the room. I did not break my stride. I did not even glance in their direction. Before the guards could reach me, Mr. Harrington stepped smoothly past me and approached the stage. He did not look like a small-town estate lawyer tonight. He moved with the undeniable authority of a man who held the financial fate of everyone in the room. He bypassed the security guards, climbed the short steps to the stage, and calmly commandeered the secondary microphone. "Stand down, gentlemen," Mr. Harrington commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "If you lay a single finger on my client, you will be personally named in a federal lawsuit before the appetizers are served." The guards froze, looking up at Trent for direction. The entire ballroom descended into a suffocating silence. Beatrice was gripping Sienna's arm, her face drained of all color, her jaw hanging open in shock. "Who let you in here?" Trent demanded, stepping aggressively toward Mr. Harrington. "This is a closed shareholder event. You have no authority here. Get off my stage before I have you arrested." Mr. Harrington adjusted his glasses, completely unbothered by Trent's posturing. He pulled a thick leather-bound dossier from his briefcase and placed it squarely on the podium. "I have every authority," Mr. Harrington stated, turning to face the hundreds of confused executives and investors in the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Arthur Harrington. I represent Apex Guardian Holdings. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Apex Guardian executed a hostile takeover of this corporation, acquiring 51% of all voting shares." A collective gasp swept through the room. The board members sitting near the front row began whispering frantically to one another, pulling out their phones to check their portfolios. Trent stepped back, shaking his head in aggressive denial. "That is impossible," Trent snapped, his voice pitching higher. "A takeover of that magnitude requires massive capital. We would have seen it coming. You cannot just buy out a company of this size overnight without triggering a dozen federal oversight warnings. You can when you utilize a $50 million blind trust. Mr. Harrington replied smoothly. The funds were transferred securely and legally, utilizing private acquisitions that bypassed public reporting delays. The ink is dry, Trent. Apex Guardian is now the majority shareholder of this firm. And as the legal representative of that holding company, I am here to formally introduce your new owner. Mr. Harrington stepped aside and gestured toward me. I walked up the steps and took my place at the podium. I looked down at Trent, who was staring at me as if I had just materialized from thin air. Good evening, everyone, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent ballroom. My name is Clara. You might know me as Trent's former wife, but moving forward you will refer to me as the majority owner and newly appointed chairwoman of the board. Sienna let out a choked sob from the front row. Beatrice looked as though she was going to be physically sick. The smug superiority they had worn like armor was completely shattered, replaced by the terrifying realization that I held their entire world in the palm of my hand. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, transforming into a chaotic hum of realization. My first official act as chairwoman. I continued turning my head to look directly at Trent, is to initiate a comprehensive federal audit of the Executive Finance Department. We will be investigating extensive embezzlement, corporate wire fraud, and the unauthorized diversion of company funds to private offshore accounts. Trent's chest heaved. He looked trapped, his eyes darting frantically toward the exits as the board members began glaring at him with sudden, venomous suspicion. The brilliant career he had built on lies and stolen money was collapsing around him in real time. But Trent was a survivor, a rat who always thought he could find a way out of a burning building. The panic in his eyes suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating gleam. He let out a harsh, nervous laugh that echoed weirdly through the tense room. He straightened his jacket and walked right up to me, standing close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne. You really think you have won? Trent, sneered his voice, dropping to a low, mocking whisper that was amplified by the microphone. You can buy the company, Clara. You can run your little audits. But you cannot touch me. He turned to face the audience, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of absolute defiance. My personal assets are secure, Trent declared loudly. The divorce decree is finalized and stamped by the state. And thanks to the ironclad prenuptial agreement you signed, my personal wealth, my real estate holdings, and my vested stock options are protected from you entirely. You cannot touch a single dime of my personal money, Clara. You might own the company, but I'm walking out of here a very rich man. I let his words hang in the dead silence of the ballroom. Trent stood there, his chest puffed out, breathing heavily into the microphone. He looked like a conqueror who had just claimed victory on a bloody battlefield. He truly believed he had won. He believed that his money, his status, and his bespoke tuxedo insulated him from any real consequence. He thought he was untouchable. I glanced at Mr. Harrington, who gave a brief, highly satisfied nod. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a small electronic clicker. He pointed it toward the audiovisual booth situated at the far back of the room and pressed a single button. The massive digital screen behind us, which had been displaying the corporate logo in shimmering, arrogant gold, suddenly flickered. The logo vanished into blackness. In its place appeared a high-resolution, 50-foot-tall scan of a federal court order. It bore the unmistakable official seal of the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington. A collective gasp echoed through the crowd as the hundreds of attendees squinted to read the bold legal text projected above our heads. Trent spun around, his eyes locking onto the massive document. His smug expression faltered immediately, replaced by a sudden, intense confusion. He blinked, trying to process the heavy legal jargon looming over him. I leaned into the microphone, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers and sweeping across the vast room. You really should have paid more attention in those corporate law seminars, Trent, I said smoothly. Or at the very least, you should have hired a far better lawyer than your compromised brother-in-law. I pointed a finger up at the second paragraph of the projected document. Let me give you a quick, incredibly expensive lesson on Washington state family law. You are correct about one specific thing. The divorce decree that Jamal fraudulently pushed through the judicial system is officially finalized. You wanted to be a single man so desperately that you bypassed every legal safeguard to make it happen. The state officially recognizes that dissolution. We are legally permanently divorced. Trent crossed his arms, trying desperately to maintain his arrogant, powerful posture, but I saw a heavy bead of sweat form at his temple and roll down his cheek. Then what is this? He demanded, gesturing wildly toward the massive screen behind us. This, I replied. Never breaking eye contact is the direct consequence of your breathtaking arrogance. When you and Jamal orchestrated that quiet little backroom divorce, you committed what the federal courts call fraudulent concealment. You intentionally hid assets, you forged my digital signature, and you utilized an illegal, unmonitored legal channel to expedite a ruling without my knowledge or consent. I stepped away from the podium and walked directly toward him, forcing him to look me in the eye. The problem with committing federal wire fraud to execute a divorce is that it completely obliterates any pre-existing contracts attached to that marriage. The judge reviewed the server logs from Jamal's office this afternoon, and because of your blatant criminal deception, the court issued an immediate ruling on our prenuptial agreement. I raised my hand and gestured to the brightly highlighted text on the massive screen. Read the ruling, Trent. Read it out loud for the board of directors. The prenuptial agreement is declared void ab initio. That is Latin for invalid from the start. The document you thought was your impenetrable shield has just been legally eradicated. It does not exist. Jamal let out a pathetic, strangled noise from the floor below the stage. He was gripping the edge of a cocktail table, looking like he might vomit. He knew exactly what that Latin phrase meant. Beatrice gripped Sienna's arm so tightly that the younger woman yelped in pain, trying to pull away from her monstrous mother-in-law. Trent shook his head rapidly, stumbling backward, as if the words themselves were physically striking him. No, that is not how it works. You cannot just void a contract. I have lawyers, I have offshore accounts, I have protections. You do not have a prenuptial agreement anymore, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. And since Washington is a strict community property state, the sudden death of our pre-NOP means that every single asset acquired during our 10-year marriage is now automatically subject to a 50-50 split. The ballroom erupted into sheer chaos. Corporate investors were openly staring at Trent in horror. He was not just losing control of the company he was supposed to run. He was losing his entire personal empire in front of the very people he had invited to witness his crowning achievement. I stepped back to the microphone, speaking over the rising roar of the crowd. That means I am legally entitled to 50% of your real estate holdings, 50% of your luxury investment portfolios, 50% of your vested stock options, and 50% of every dollar sitting in your personal bank accounts. But that is just the beginning. Because you committed active fraud to secure this divorce, the judge has also awarded me punitive damages to be extracted directly from your remaining half. Trent looked like all the oxygen had been vacuumed from his lungs. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. He looked down at Sienna, who was backing away from the stage in her expensive maternity gown, her hands covering her face as the reality of her ruined meal ticket set in. Beatrice was swaying on her feet, leaning heavily against a waiter to keep from collapsing to the marble floor. You thought you could discard me, Trent? I continued, my voice echoing with cold, surgical precision. You thought you could forge my name, lock me out of my own home, and hand me a $10,000 check like a pity severance package. You thought your money made you a god. But your money was built on lies, and now those lies have cost you everything. I own the company. I own the house. And as of today, I own your future. Trent's eyes darted wildly around the chaotic room. He was a trapped animal. The security guards he had summoned were now standing firmly down, deferring completely to the new majority shareholder. The board of directors, who were supposed to crown him CEO tonight, were looking at him with utter disgust, calculating exactly how quickly they could distance their portfolios from a man about to be indicted by the federal government. He was losing his entire world, but his survival instinct kicked in with a desperate, frantic energy. He remembered his slush funds. He remembered the millions he had funneled into dummy accounts and overseas sanctuaries, the money he had stolen from this very company that I had not yet legally frozen through the international courts. Trent stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the heavy microphone cord on the stage. He plunged his shaking hand into his tuxedo pocket and ripped out his phone. His fingers flew across the glass screen, his face twisted in a mask of absolute terror and desperation. He was logging into his encrypted offshore banking app, frantically trying to wire the remaining millions to a ghost account before my lawyers could submit the freeze orders to the international banking servers. He was typing with manic speed, his thumb hovering dangerously over the final transfer button, sweat pouring down his face as he tried to secure the last remaining lifeline he had left. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom remained firmly shut by Mr. Harrington's security team. No one was leaving. Trent's thumb slammed down on the glowing green transfer button. The harsh artificial light from his smartphone screen illuminated the raw terror completely consuming his face. For one fraction of a second, he let out a ragged exhale, genuinely believing he had beaten the clock. He believed his offshore sanctuary was secure. Then the screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving red. A sharp error tone beeped from the device, cutting through the heavy silence of the ballroom. Trent furiously tapped the screen again and again. His manic tapping turned into desperate, violent strikes against the glass. He refreshed the application. He closed it and reopened it, but the message displayed in bold red letters remained identical. Error. Transaction denied. Federal seizure order active. You are holding your phone upside down if you are looking for an escape hatch, Trent, I said, leaning casually against the crystal podium. Let me save you the trouble of calling customer service. Cayman Islands, Grand Harbor Bank, account routing number ending in 4472. Trent slowly lowered the phone, his hands trembling so violently he nearly dropped it. He stared up at me, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of his usual arrogance. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords refused to produce a sound. You really thought I just found out about your little embezzlement scheme this morning? I continued, my voice echoing evenly across the shocked audience of corporate elites. I am a cyber forensics auditor. Finding money that people try to hide is literally my only job. When I audited your back-end networks 3 weeks ago, I found the dummy vendor invoices paying for Sienna's luxury lifestyle. But I also found the digital breadcrumbs you left behind when you funneled the rest of your stolen cash into the Caribbean. I stepped down from the podium and walked slowly toward the edge of the stage, looking down at the man who had tried to destroy my life. You see, Trent, when you move millions of dollars across international borders without declaring it, you do not just anger a corporate board. You anger the Internal Revenue Service. 2 weeks ago, I compiled a 500-page evidentiary dossier detailing every single fraudulent wire transfer, every hidden shell company, and every fake tax return you filed over the last 3 years. I handed that dossier directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. The color completely drained from Trent's face, leaving him a ghastly shade of gray. The murmurs in the ballroom intensified into a chaotic uproar. Corporate executives were already backing away from Trent as if his very presence was contagious. They recognized exactly what federal tax evasion meant. The federal government moves incredibly fast when you hand them a neatly packaged map to millions in stolen untaxed revenue, I explained, crossing my arms. Those accounts are not just temporarily frozen, Trent. They have been seized by the United States government. Every penny you stole, every asset you hid is gone. You do not just have $0, you owe millions in back taxes, severe federal penalties, and restitution. You are completely, undeniably penniless. Trent collapsed. His knees simply gave out, hitting the hard marble floor with a sickening thud. He dropped his phone, the screen shattering against the ground, a perfect physical representation of his ruined life. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, guttural sob. The powerful, untouchable vice president was gone, replaced by a broken criminal, waiting for the federal authorities to arrive. But the absolute destruction of Trent was not the final act of this tragedy. Sienna had been standing perfectly still in the front row, clutching her designer handbag. The glowing maternal aura she had weaponized just a day ago evaporated instantly. She looked at Trent, groveling on the floor, then looked up at the massive court order projected on the screen. The realization washed over her features, twisting her face into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic and rage. The limitless black credit cards, the private jets, the promised luxury estate, it was all ash. The baby she was carrying was no longer a golden ticket to high society. It was an anchor to a convicted felon facing decades behind bars. "Are you broke?" Sienna shrieked, her voice shattering the remaining decorum in the room. She stepped toward Trent, practically vibrating with fury. "Tell me you are not broke. What about my condo? What about my allowance?" Trent did not look up. He just continued to sob into his hands, completely unresponsive. Sienna let out a sound of pure disgust. "I am not raising a baby in a trailer park while you sit in federal prison." She spun around, her eyes locking onto Beatrice. Beatrice was already trying to retreat toward the exit, desperately attempting to shield her face from the dozens of cell phones now recording the spectacle. Her country club friends had completely abandoned her, actively whispering and pointing as the prestigious Blackwood family name went up in flames. Sienna lunged forward, grabbing Beatrice by the sleeve of her emerald silk dress. "You," Sienna demanded, her voice shrill and demanding. "You fix this right now. You write me a check. You promised me a lifestyle, Beatrice. You told me I was saving your family line. Pay me." Beatrice wrenched her arm away, looking at Sienna with absolute revulsion. "Do not touch me, you vulgar little gold digger. Are you insane? My son's assets are frozen. Everything is tied up. I am not giving you a single cent. Security, get this screaming woman away from me." Beatrice tried to turn her back, determined to salvage whatever tiny fraction of dignity she had left, and walk out of the ballroom. But she severely underestimated a desperate woman who had just watched her entire future burn to the ground. Sienna did not back down. Instead, she stepped directly into Beatrice's path, blocking her escape. Her eyes narrowed into dangerous, calculating slits. The superficial sweetness was gone, replaced by a ruthless survival instinct. "You think you can just walk away from me?" Sienna asked, her voice dropping an octave, but loud enough for the entire front row of investors to hear clearly. "You think you can leave me holding the bag after everything Trent did? I owe you nothing," Beatrice hissed, her voice trembling with barely suppressed panic. "You are nothing but a mistake my son made." Sienna let out a dark, menacing laugh. "Really? Because Trent told me everything, Beatrice. He told me exactly how you got your hands on the family estate after his father died." Beatrice froze. Her entire body went rigid, and her eyes widened in absolute, unmistakable horror. "You write me a check right now!" Beatrice Sienna snarled, jabbing a finger directly into her mother-in-law's chest. "You wire me $5 million by midnight, or I swear to God I will take this microphone and tell this entire room exactly what you put in your late husband's tea the night he had his fatal heart attack. I know your secrets. Beatrice and I will burn you to the ground with us. What happens when a cornered woman with nothing to lose turns on her own flesh and blood?" The rest of the day moved with ruthless mechanical efficiency. While Trent was busy getting fitted for his bespoke tuxedo and rehearsing his arrogant victory speech, I was sitting in a secure glass-walled boardroom high above the city skyline. I was flanked by Mr. Harrington and three of the most aggressive, highly paid corporate acquisition specialists in the Pacific Northwest. We were not there to negotiate. We were there to finalize the paperwork that would permanently sever Trent from his illusions of grandeur. I had spent the entire morning liquidating the $50 million blind trust my grandfather had left me. For years, I had kept that money hidden untouched, waiting for a rainy day. I never expected that I would use it to orchestrate a hostile takeover, systematically buying up every available share of Trent's company through aggressive private acquisitions. By noon, the ink was dry. I did not just have leverage anymore. I owned the board. The annual shareholder gala was held in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive luxury hotel. It was a sickening display of corporate excess. As I arrived at the venue, I could see the valet line packed with imported sports cars and black stretch limousines. I stepped out of my town car, wearing a tailored midnight blue evening gown that swept the floor. It was a stark contrast to the conservative, invisible office attire Trent had always demanded I wear, so I would not outshine him. Tonight, I was not hiding in his shadow. I bypassed the red carpet and slipped through a side entrance, taking up a position in the shadowed alcove just outside the main double doors of the ballroom. Inside, the event was in full swing. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the sea of expensive tuxedos and designer evening gowns. A string quartet played softly in the corner, entirely drowned out by the sound of clinking champagne glasses and the hum of corporate networking. Trent was entirely in his element. He stood behind a towering crystal podium on the main stage, illuminated by a brilliant spotlight. He was delivering a grandiose, thoroughly rehearsed speech about visionary leadership and the aggressive future of the company. His voice boomed through the massive sound system, dripping with false humility and unearned confidence. He spoke passionately about corporate integrity, transparency, and family values. The words tasted like ash just listening to them, knowing he was actively funneling company capital to a phantom marketing agency to fund his mistress. Through the slightly parted mahogany doors, I could see the front row. Beatrice was sitting dead center, draped in emerald silk, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She was putting on a spectacular performance of maternal pride, whispering excitedly to her wealthy country club friends, undoubtedly boasting about her brilliant son, the incoming chief executive officer. Beside her sat Sienna. She was glowing in a skin-tight silver designer dress that accentuated her pregnant belly. She was soaking in the admiring glances of the corporate wives, casually adjusting her wrist to show off the $50,000 diamond tennis bracelet Trent had bought her with stolen company funds. They looked like the perfect, untouchable family royalty. They were completely oblivious to the guillotine poised directly above their heads. Trent reached the crescendo of his speech, loudly outlining his ambitious, aggressive expansion plans for his first year as CEO. The crowd began to applaud, a wave of validating noise that washed over his smiling face. I looked at Mr. Harrington, who gave a sharp, satisfied nod. It was time. I pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot, cutting cleanly through the polite applause and Trent's amplified voice. Heads turned instantly. The whispers rippled through the hundreds of attendees as my legal team and I marched straight down the center aisle. I kept my gaze locked dead ahead, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The crowd parted for us, automatically creating a clear, unobstructed path directly to the stage. Trent froze mid-sentence. His arrogant, triumphant smile collapsed instantly into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He gripped the edges of the crystal podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He leaned aggressively into the microphone, his voice sharp and laced with sudden panic. "Security!" Trent barked, the sound echoing harshly through the massive speakers. "Remove this woman immediately. She is a disgruntled former family member, and she is trespassing on a private corporate event. Get her out of here right now." Two burly security guards in dark suits moved rapidly from the perimeter of the room, intercepting my path. I did not break my stride. I did not even glance in their direction. Before the guards could reach me, Mr. Harrington stepped smoothly past me and approached the stage. He did not look like a small-town estate lawyer tonight. He moved with the undeniable, terrifying authority of a man who held the financial fate of everyone in the room. He bypassed the hesitating security guards, climbed the short steps to the stage, and calmly commandeered the secondary microphone stand. "Stand down, gentlemen!" Mr. Harrington commanded, his voice rolling across the silent ballroom with absolute authority. "If you lay a single finger on my client, you will be personally named in a devastating federal lawsuit before the appetizers are even served." The guards froze instantly, backing away and looking up at Trent for direction. The entire ballroom descended into a suffocating, tense silence. Beatrice was gripping Sienna's arm, her face drained of all color, her jaw hanging open in shock. "Who let you in here?" Trent demanded, stepping aggressively toward Mr. Harrington, his face flushed with rage. "This is a closed shareholder event. You have absolutely no authority here. Get off my stage before I have you arrested." Mr. Harrington adjusted his glasses, completely unbothered by Trent's posturing. He pulled a thick leather-bound dossier from his briefcase and dropped it squarely on the podium with a heavy thud. "I have every authority," Mr. Harrington stated, turning away from Trent to face the hundreds of confused executives and wealthy investors in the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Arthur Harrington. I represent the legal interests of Apex Guardian Holdings. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Apex Guardian executed an aggressive hostile takeover of this corporation, acquiring 51% of all available voting shares. A collective gasp swept through the room. The board of directors sitting in the VIP section near the front row began whispering frantically to one another, pulling out their phones to desperately check their portfolios. Trent stepped back, shaking his head in aggressive, panicked denial. "That is impossible!" Trent snapped, his voice pitching higher in desperation. "A takeover of that magnitude requires massive capital. We would have seen it coming. You cannot just buy out a company of this size overnight without triggering a dozen federal oversight warnings. You can when you utilize a $50 million blind trust," Mr. Harrington replied smoothly, his voice cutting through Trent's denial. The funds were transferred securely and entirely legally, utilizing private acquisitions that bypassed public reporting delays. The ink is completely dry, Trent. Apex Guardian is now the undisputed majority shareholder of this firm. And as the legal representative of that holding company, I am here to formally introduce your new owner. Mr. Harrington stepped aside and gestured respectfully toward me. I walked up the steps, my dress gliding over the stage, and took my place directly at the primary podium. I looked down at Trent, who was staring at me as if I had just materialized from thin air. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the utterly silent ballroom. "My name is Clara. You might know me as Trent's former wife, but moving forward you will refer to me as the majority owner and the newly appointed chairwoman of the board of directors." Sienna let out a choked, terrified sob from the front row. Beatrice looked as though she was going to physically collapse. The smug superiority they had worn like armor was completely shattered, replaced by the terrifying realization that I held their entire corporate world in the palm of my hand. The murmurs in the crowd grew steadily louder, transforming into a chaotic hum of realization. Trent's chest heaved. He looked trapped, his eyes darting frantically toward the ballroom exits as the board members began glaring at him with sudden, venomous suspicion. The brilliant, lucrative career he had built on lies and stolen money was collapsing around him in real time. But Trent was a narcissist, a man who always believed he was the smartest person in the room. The panic in his eyes suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating gleam. He let out a harsh, incredibly nervous laugh that echoed weirdly through the tense, silent room. He straightened his jacket, adjusting his silk tie, and walked right up to me. "You really think you hold all the cards?" Trent sneered, his voice dropping to a low, mocking tone that was amplified across the room. "You think you have won because you bought the company?" He turned his back on me to face the audience, spreading his arms wide in a grandiose gesture of absolute defiance. "My personal wealth is completely untouchable," Trent declared loudly, grinning like a madman. "Our divorce is legally finalized. And thanks to the ironclad prenuptial agreement, you blindly signed, my personal assets, my real estate holdings, and my vested stock options are protected from you entirely. You can have this company, Clara, but you cannot touch a single dime of my personal money. I am walking out of here tonight a very rich man." The answer played out the very next morning on the meticulously manicured front lawn of the sprawling suburban estate Trent had arrogantly claimed as his own. The crisp morning air was thick with the distinct, highly satisfying scent of absolute defeat. I pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates, not in a rented sedan, but in the plush leather backseat of a sleek black town car. I was trailing directly behind two marked King County Sheriff vehicles, their lights flashing silently in the quiet, obscenely wealthy neighborhood. We parked in the massive circular driveway. The heavy mahogany front doors of the estate were propped wide open. Inside, a highly efficient team of court-appointed movers was systematically emptying the house. Trent, Beatrice, and Sienna were stranded on the lush green grass, surrounded by a chaotic, pathetic pile of designer luggage, garbage bags stuffed with expensive shoes and random luxury items the movers had unceremoniously dumped outside. The pristine, untouchable image they had projected at the gala just hours ago was completely obliterated. Neighbors who had once attended Beatrice's lavish summer garden parties were now standing at the edge of their driveways, holding coffee mugs and openly staring at the spectacle. The mighty Blackwood family was being dragged into the unforgiving daylight for everyone to witness. Movers marched past us in a steady stream carrying out custom golf clubs, antique vases, and massive flat-screen televisions. Everything Trent had purchased with stolen money was being repossessed by the holding company I now controlled. Trent looked like a hollow shell of a human being. He was still wearing the dark trousers and the rumpled white dress shirt from his bespoke tuxedo last night. His expensive silk bow tie hung loosely around his neck. His eyes were heavily bloodshot from a completely sleepless night of panic and terror. He sat slumped on a Louis Vuitton suitcase staring blankly at the concrete driveway. He was entirely paralyzed by the realization that his federal indictment was looming, and his offshore accounts had been seized by the government. The powerful corporate executive was completely gone. Beatrice, however, was far from paralyzed. She was pacing the length of the front lawn like a caged rabid animal. She tightly clutched her iconic pearl necklace, her designer emerald blouse wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee. The moment she saw me step out of the town car flanked by two uniformed police officers, her face contorted into a mask of pure aristocratic fury. She marched straight toward the deputies, completely ignoring my presence. "Officer," she demanded, her voice shrill and dripping with the toxic entitlement of generations of old money. "Arrest this woman immediately. She is trespassing on private property. She has orchestrated a fraudulent takeover of my son's financial assets and is illegally removing our belongings. I want her in handcuffs right now. I demand you call the mayor this instant." The lead sheriff, a tall, broad-shouldered man with absolutely zero patience for suburban melodrama, crossed his arms heavily over his tactical vest. "Ma'am, we have a federal court order right here signed by a district judge. The property legally belongs to the holding company, controlled by this lady. You were given a 2-hour grace period to vacate the premises by court mandate. That period expired exactly 4 minutes ago. You need to gather your bags and leave the property immediately, or we will be forced to physically escort you away for criminal trespassing." Beatrice gasped, pressing a trembling hand to her chest in mock horror. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she shrieked, her voice echoing down the quiet, tree-lined street. "I am Beatrice Blackwood. My family practically built this city. We pay your salary. You work for us. You do not take orders from this vindictive low-class gold digger." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. The sheriff did not even blink, clearly accustomed to wealthy people throwing desperate tantrums. I looked Beatrice dead in the eye, my voice perfectly calm and measured. "Your family name is entirely worthless, Beatrice. Your son is completely broke, facing decades in a federal prison for corporate wire fraud and massive embezzlement. Your daughter-in-law just publicly threatened to expose you for murdering your late husband. The only thing you own right now is the pile of luggage sitting on my grass." Sienna was standing near the pile of bags, scrolling frantically on her gold-plated smartphone. She looked miserable, her designer maternity dress stained and rumpled from sleeping in a hotel lobby chair. She sneered openly at Beatrice. "Do not look at me, Beatrice. I told you I wanted my $5 million. Since you decided to freeze me out, my lawyer is drafting the police report about your husband's fatal tea right now. You are going down right alongside your pathetic son." The sheer audacity of Sienna's threat, combined with the absolute humiliation of being evicted by the woman she had tormented for years, finally broke whatever remaining sanity Beatrice possessed. Her face flushed a dangerous, violent shade of crimson. Her aristocratic facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. She let out an unhinged, guttural scream of pure, unfiltered rage. "You ruined everything," Beatrice shrieked, lunging directly at me with her arm raised high. She aimed a vicious, open-handed slap entirely intended for my face, putting her entire body weight behind the strike. But I was not the terrified, compliant daughter-in-law she was used to bullying into submission. I saw the strike coming a mile away. I simply took a swift, calculated step to the right, letting gravity do the rest. Beatrice's momentum carried her violently forward. Her heavy, ring-clad hand missed my cheek completely. Instead, it slammed with a sickening, audible crack directly into the side of Sienna's face. The impact was brutal. Sienna spun backward, her arms flailing as she lost her footing on the wet morning grass. She crashed hard onto the lawn, tumbling awkwardly over a massive designer suitcase. She hit the ground with a sharp, terrified shriek, her hands immediately flying to clutch her prominent pregnant belly. Trent finally snapped out of his catatonic daze, leaping up from his suitcase with a look of sudden, frantic panic. "Mom, what the hell are you doing?" he yelled, rushing across the lawn toward Sienna. He reached out his hands to help her up from the grass. Sienna batted his hands away with absolute visceral disgust, her face contorted in physical pain and blazing fury. A bright red handprint was rapidly blooming across her pale cheek. "Do not touch me!" Sienna screamed at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice echoing off the brick facade of the massive house. "Get your filthy hands off me, Trent! You are completely broke and you are going to federal prison. I am done pretending to care about you." She dragged herself up onto her elbows, glaring at Trent, with a look of pure venomous hatred. She pointed a shaking finger right at his face, unleashing the final devastating blow. "And do not act like you care about this baby. You are not even the father." The words hung in this crisp morning air like a physical weight. Trent stared down at Sienna, his jaw slack, his eyes wide and vacant, the total paralysis of a man whose entire universe had just been fundamentally disproved. The absolute destruction of his ego was playing out in real time on the front lawn of the estate he no longer owned. I did not simply watch the destruction. I walked over to the stack of boxes the court-appointed movers had left near the driveway. I opened my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. This was the secondary dossier I had compiled during my forensic audit. "She is telling the exact truth, Trent," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the manicured lawn. I flipped the folder open. "While you were busy liquidating your own corporate assets to buy her tennis bracelets and penthouse suites, Sienna was keeping her financial options incredibly open." I stepped forward and held up a heavily highlighted bank statement for the entire yard to see. "Monthly wire transfers." I continued, my tone analytical and completely devoid of sympathy. "Exactly $25,000 deposited into a hidden offshore account registered under Sienna's maiden name. The deposit started exactly 2 months before she miraculously bumped into you at that charity gala." I tracked the routing numbers through 3 different international shell companies. Sienna scrambled to her feet, her hand still pressed against her stinging red cheek where Beatrice had struck her. Her eyes shifted from furious to cornered. She looked at the folder in my hand with pure, unadulterated panic. "The account ultimately belongs to a holding corporation controlled by Julian Vance," I announced, dropping the final piece of the puzzle. "The chief executive officer of Vance Dynamics. Your biggest, most aggressive corporate rival." Trent looked like he had been physically struck. He took a stumbling step backward, shaking his head in a pathetic, broken gesture of denial. "No. No, that is a lie. We took medical tests. We went to the doctor together. I saw the ultrasound." Sienna laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that contained no humor. "You paid for a private concierge clinic, Trent. You handed over a massive check for VIP treatment. For $10,000 in cash, the clinic director was more than happy to print a piece of paper with your name on it. You were so desperate to prove your virility and secure your place as the Blackwood patriarch, you never even questioned the timeline. Julian Vance did not just want your market share, Trent," I explained, closing the folder with a sharp snap. "He wanted to completely humiliate you. Sienna was a very highly paid distraction. A beautiful, heavily sponsored mole designed to keep you blind and arrogant, while Julian actively poached your top clients. And when she got pregnant with Julian's child, they simply decided to let you foot the bill for the luxury maternity care. You played right into their hands." Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half dry heave. She pressed both hands over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically to Sienna's stomach. "My grandson Beatrice," whispered, her hands clawing at her ruined emerald blouse. "You told me he was the Blackwood heir. You told me this child would secure our legacy. You dirty, manipulating little fraud." Before Beatrice could launch another physical attack, a sleek silver Mercedes abruptly pulled onto the edge of the driveway, its tires screeching slightly against the pavement. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out, slamming the door behind him. This was Jamal Trent's highly aggressive elite defense attorney. He had clearly rushed over the moment the eviction started, but he was walking directly into a war zone. "Trent, do not say another word," Jamal commanded, striding across the lawn with his briefcase firmly in hand. "Do not engage with these women. We are leaving right now. I have filed an emergency injunction against the property seizure, but we need to get off this lawn before the press arrives and turns this into a public circus." Trent did not hear a single word his lawyer said. The veins in his neck were bulging against his unbuttoned white collar. His face had gone from a sickly pale to a terrifying mottled purple. He was staring at Sienna's stomach, realizing with agonizing clarity that he had destroyed his marriage, his career, his wealth, and his entire future for a rival CEO's unborn child. The sheer magnitude of his foolishness shattered whatever remained of his self-control. "You set me up!" Trent roared. It was an ugly, primal sound. All the polished corporate veneer evaporated, leaving only violent, humiliated rage. He lunged forward, his hands outstretched like claws aiming directly for Sienna's throat. Sienna shrieked and scrambled backward, tripping awkwardly over a discarded garbage bag full of designer shoes. She fell hard against the manicured bushes lining the driveway. Before Trent could wrap his hands around her neck, Jamal intercepted him. The attorney threw his expensive briefcase aside and tackled his client around the waist, using his entire body weight to drag Trent backward away from the terrified woman. "Get off me!" Trent screamed, thrashing wildly, his arms swinging in blind fury. "I am going to kill her. I am going to destroy her life like she destroyed mine. Let me go." "Stop being an idiot," Jamal grunted, straining heavily to hold the much larger man back. His expensive suit jacket ripped at the shoulder as Trent violently twisted against his grip. "You are already facing a massive federal indictment, Trent. Do not add aggravated assault to your rap sheet. If you touch a pregnant woman in front of witnesses, no judge in this state will ever grant you bail. Back down right now." Trent continued to thrash his expensive leather shoes, tearing up deep chunks of the pristine grass. He was completely unreachable, lost in a blind haze of absolute humiliation and betrayal. But the violent physical struggle was suddenly drowned out. In the distance, cutting sharply through the crisp morning air, came the unmistakable rising wail of police sirens. It was not just one or two distant cars. It was a chorus of heavy, urgent sirens approaching the neighborhood at high speed. The sound echoed off the massive suburban mansions, growing louder and more oppressive by the second. Trent froze the fight, instantly draining out of his body. He stopped thrashing against Jamal and looked toward the towering wrought iron gates at the end of the driveway. The flashing red and blue lights were already reflecting brightly off the towering oak trees lining the street. The authorities were descending upon the estate rapidly, and given the sheer volume of the sirens wailing in the distance, they were absolutely not coming for a simple domestic dispute. The deafening roar of the sirens reached a fever pitch as a massive convoy swarmed the quiet, tree-lined suburban street. This was not a standard wellness check. 4 matte, black, heavily armored SUVs tore around the corner, flanked by 3 additional marked county sheriff cruisers. They swerved aggressively into the circular driveway, their heavy tires chewing up the manicured edges of Beatrice's prized rose bushes. The vehicles slammed into park, forming an impenetrable steel barricade that completely blocked the exit. Trent let go of his struggling attorney and staggered backward. He frantically tried to brush the dirt and grass off his ruined trousers, desperately attempting to piece his shattered dignity back together. His breathing was ragged, but he still clung to the absurd delusion that he possessed some measure of control. He assumed a neighbor had called emergency services because of Sienna screaming on the lawn. He puffed out his chest, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and prepared to deliver his usual arrogant, privileged narrative to the local authorities. Officer Trent yelled, waving his hand toward the first vehicle. "Thank God you are here. I need you to arrest these 2 women immediately. They are trespassing on my property, assaulting my family, and causing a massive public disturbance." The doors of the black SUVs flew open in perfect, terrifying unison. The men and women stepping out onto the driveway were not local beat cops responding to a noise complaint. They were wearing dark tactical vests over heavy windbreakers. The bright, unforgiving yellow letters FBI were stamped boldly across their backs. I leaned comfortably against the cool metal of my town car, crossing my arms over my chest. I watched the exact moment Trent's brain processed those 3 yellow letters. The arrogant, entitled sneer melted entirely off his face, replaced by a hollow, sickening terror. His knees physically buckled, and he had to grab the edge of a nearby wardrobe box just to remain standing. The lead agent, a severe-looking woman with a tight bun and a heavy clipboard, marched directly toward the center of the lawn. She did not look at Sienna sobbing on the grass. She did not look at Beatrice standing in stunned silence. She walked straight up to Trent, completely ignoring his frantic attempts to look authoritative. Trenton Blackwood, the agent, stated, her voice sharp and echoing with absolute uncompromising authority. "Yes," Trent choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic high-pitched squeak. "I am Trent Blackwood. But there has to be a huge mistake. You have the wrong house." "There is no mistake," the agent replied, signaling to 2 heavily armed deputies behind her. "Trenton Blackwood, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and aggravated tax evasion." Trent backed away, his hands raised in a trembling gesture of surrender. "Wait. No. You cannot do this. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Guardian. I am a respected businessman. You do not understand what is happening here. This is a setup." The agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her tactical belt. "We understand perfectly, Mr. Blackwood. We received a highly detailed 500-page forensic audit directly from the Internal Revenue Service this morning. The dossier outlines your creation of 7 different offshore shell companies, the falsification of 3 years of corporate tax returns, and the direct embezzlement of $12 million from your own shareholders." Trent's eyes darted wildly toward me. He finally understood exactly what I had been doing for the last 3 weeks while he was busy picking out tuxedo patterns and planning his victory lap. I had not just taken his company. I had meticulously packaged his entire criminal history and hand-delivered it to the federal government. The 2 deputies lunged forward, grabbing Trent by his shoulders and spinning him around violently. They kicked his legs apart and slammed him face first against the hood of one of the black SUVs. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing across the driveway was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Beatrice completely lost her mind. The reality of seeing her golden child, the prestigious heir to the Blackwood legacy, being treated like a common street criminal shattered her aristocratic facade permanently. She rushed forward, her heels clicking frantically against the pavement, waving her hands in the air. "Stop it!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams. "Unhand my son right now! Do you have any idea who we are? We are the Blackwoods. We own half the real estate in this county. You cannot treat us like this. I will have your badges. I will call the governor. I will ruin your entire department." "Ma'am, step back immediately, or you will be placed under arrest for obstructing a federal investigation," the lead agent warned, resting her hand casually on her utility belt. "Your son is a flight risk with seized offshore assets. He is going into federal custody, and he will not be granted bail." Beatrice spun around wildly, her panicked eyes landing on Jamal. The elite high-priced defense attorney was standing a few feet away, silently dusting off his torn suit jacket. Beatrice lunged at him, grabbing the lapels of his jacket with both hands, shaking him violently. "Jamal, do something!" Beatrice screamed, spit flying from her lips as she gripped his suit. "You are our lawyer. We pay your firm millions of dollars. Get an injunction. Call a judge. Stop them from taking my son away. Fix this right now." Jamal was a shark. He was a ruthless, calculating survivor who had built his lucrative career by knowing exactly when a ship was sinking. He looked past Beatrice's hysterical face and locked eyes with me. I did not say a word. I simply reached into my designer handbag, pulled out a small silver flash drive, and held it up in the morning light. I tapped it gently against my chin, offering him a cold, knowing smile. Jamal knew exactly what was on that drive. He knew I possessed the digital signatures, proving he had personally drafted the fraudulent offshore paperwork for Trent's shell companies. He knew that if he stepped forward to defend Trent, I would hand that flash drive directly to the lead FBI agent and he would be sharing a federal holding cell with his client by noon. Jamal looked at the flashing red and blue lights. He looked at Trent sobbing against the hood of the SUV. Then he looked down at Beatrice's hands clutching his ruined lapels. With absolute surgical precision, Jamal reached up and peeled Beatrice's manicured fingers off his suit. He smoothed down his tie, took a slow, deliberate step backward, and raised both of his hands in a universal gesture of surrender toward the federal agents. "I am sorry," Beatrice, Jamal said, his voice completely devoid of any emotion or loyalty. "I do not represent him anymore." I watched the red taillights of Jamal's silver Mercedes fade into the gloomy shadows of the subterranean parking garage. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the concrete pillars. The glowing screen of my laptop illuminated my face in the dim light. The progress bar for the scheduled email hit 100%. I had promised the corrupt attorney I would not send the damning evidence to the State Bar Association tonight, and I always keep my promises. The email containing every fraudulent document, forged signature, and illegal wire transfer he had ever drafted for the Blackwood family was locked and securely set to hit the inbox of the disciplinary committee at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I closed my laptop with a sharp click, sliding Jamal's encrypted hard drive securely into my leather briefcase. Tomorrow was going to be an incredibly busy day. The morning sun glared harshly through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the executive boardroom on the 50th floor, offering a commanding view of the city skyline. As I walked through the heavy double-glass doors, the atmosphere inside the room was suffocatingly tense. 12 men in immaculately tailored suits sat around the massive, polished mahogany table. These were Trent's most fiercely loyal sycophants. They were the senior board of directors, who had enabled, protected, and heavily profited from his arrogance for the past decade. They did not look like men whose chief executive officer had just been dragged away in federal handcuffs 24 hours prior. Instead, they looked incredibly smug. I took my place at the head of the table, placing my briefcase down with a deliberate thud. "Good morning, gentlemen," I stated smoothly. "As the new majority shareholder and chairwoman of this corporation, I am calling this emergency board meeting to order. We have a massive amount of corporate restructuring to execute today, and I expect your full cooperation." A man named Richard Sterling, the silver-haired vice chairman who had served as Trent's primary enforcer, leaned back in his expensive leather chair and steepled his fingers. He offered me a condescending, deeply patronizing smile. "I am afraid you will not be restructuring anything," Clara Sterling said, completely omitting my new title. "You might have managed to buy 51% of the shares, but you severely underestimated the bylaws of our corporate charter. We are not Trent. We are not easily intimidated." Sterling slid a thick-bound legal document across the polished wood, stopping it right in front of me. "Section 4, paragraph 12, he announced loudly, his voice echoing with arrogant triumph. "In the event of a hostile transfer of majority shares, the acting board of directors retains the explicit right to trigger an emergency suspension of executive powers. This maneuver requires a 2/3 majority vote, which we successfully secured in a private session 30 minutes before you arrived. Furthermore, since your shares were acquired using funds previously tied to the Blackwood family estate, we have filed a formal injunction claiming those assets are subject to the ongoing federal embezzlement investigation. Your voting rights are officially frozen, Clara. You are entirely powerless here." The other board members chuckled, leaning back in their chairs, crossing their arms in unified defiance. They honestly believed they had outsmarted me. They believed they could lock me out of my own company and maintain the corrupt empire they had built with Trent. I did not react to Sterling's aggressive posturing. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of panic. I simply reached into my briefcase and pulled out my sleek silver laptop. I opened the screen and plugged the auxiliary cable from the boardroom's state-of-the-art audiovisual system directly into my headphone jack. "You gentlemen have always been incredibly thorough when it comes to protecting your own wealth," I said calmly. typing in the decryption password for the files I had extracted from Jamal's hard drive last night. But you made one catastrophic miscalculation. You trusted a defense attorney who was only loyal to his own survival. Sterling's smug smile faltered slightly. His eyes darted to the massive projection screen at the front of the room, which had just flickered to life, displaying a single ominous audio file. Jamal was highly efficient, I explained, my voice dropping to a cold, razor-sharp register. He did not just keep paper records of your illegal offshore transactions. He meticulously recorded his private meetings to ensure he always had absolute leverage if Trent ever tried to throw him under the bus. Meetings that all of you attended. I pressed the spacebar. Instantly, Trent's unmistakable voice blasted through the boardroom's surround sound speakers. The audio quality was pristine, capturing every single word with terrifying clarity. The offshore accounts are bleeding us dry. Trent's recorded voice echoed aggressively. Sienna's expenses are doubling, and Beatrice needs another $2 million to cover the estate taxes by Friday. The corporate marketing fund is completely tapped out. I need liquidity right now. Then Sterling's recorded voice chimed in, sounding just as arrogant on the tape as he did sitting right in front of me. It is not a problem, Trent. We simply divert the necessary capital directly from the employee pension fund. We label it as a high-yield, long-term internal restructuring investment. By the time the auditors notice the discrepancy in the quarterly reports, we will have backfilled the missing $20 million using the third quarter projections. The employees will never know their retirement accounts are empty. I hit the spacebar again, pausing the audio. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The smug, condescending expressions had been wiped clean, entirely replaced by raw, suffocating horror. The color completely drained from Richard Sterling's face, leaving him a sickly pale shade of gray. Several board members were visibly shaking their eyes wide with the realization that they had just listened to their own voices committing federal conspiracy and massive financial fraud. That is just track 1 of 47, I stated evenly, unplugging my laptop and closing it with a sharp snap. I have hours of high-definition audio detailing exactly how every single man at this table conspired to rob thousands of hardworking employees of their life savings to fund Trent's mistresses and your own exorbitant bonuses. Sterling swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. Clara, he stammered, his voice entirely stripped of its previous arrogance. We can negotiate this. We can offer you a highly lucrative buyout. We can ensure you walk away with triple your initial investment. Whatever you want. I stood up slowly from the head of the table, looking down at the 12 men who thought they could intimidate me. I do not negotiate with criminals, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. That corporate injunction you filed is entirely worthless, and your emergency suspension vote is completely invalid. I am not stepping down. You are. I picked up my briefcase, my eyes locking onto Sterling's terrified face. Every single one of you is fired, effective immediately. I declared, my voice absolute and unwavering. Security is waiting in the hallway with empty cardboard boxes for your belongings. You have exactly 10 minutes to clear out your desks and surrender your corporate access cards before I hand this entire audio drive directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I strongly suggest you move quickly. The 12 men did not utter a single word in their defense. The audio recording had completely stripped them of their manufactured bravado. Richard Sterling stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He grabbed his designer briefcase with trembling hands, practically tripping over his own chair as he scrambled toward the heavy glass doors. The rest of the board immediately followed suit, shoving each other out of the way in a pathetic, desperate stampede to escape the room before federal agents arrived. I watched them go, my face a mask of absolute indifference. The corporate purge was complete. I owned the company, but my work was far from over. Across town, a very different kind of desperation was playing out in the heavily tinted, velvet-lined private appraisal room of Kensington estate buyers. Beatrice Blackwood sat rigidly in a plush leather wingback chair, clutching a worn mahogany lockbox in her lap. Her world had completely collapsed in the span of 48 hours. Trent was sitting in a federal holding cell, denied bail, facing decades in prison. Jamal had publicly abandoned them, leaving Beatrice to scramble for a new defense attorney. Every single bank account tied to the Blackwood name was frozen by government mandate. She had zero liquidity. The only wealth she had left was the legendary Blackwood family jewelry collection pieces she claimed had been passed down through generations of aristocratic bloodlines. The appraiser, a meticulous man named Mr. Vance, sat across from her. He wore a crisp, tailored suit and white cotton gloves. Beatrice placed the mahogany box on the glass table between them. She unlocked the brass latch with a small key and pushed the lid open. Inside, resting on faded black velvet, sat a breathtaking array of jewels. The centerpiece was the famous Blackwood emerald choker surrounded by diamond tennis bracelets, sapphire drop earrings, and a massive ruby cocktail ring. "These are priceless historical artifacts," Beatrice announced, her voice dripping with its usual haughty entitlement, though her hands shook slightly. "I require an immediate cash loan against their value. $500,000 should suffice for the retainer my son's new legal counsel is demanding. I expect absolute discretion." Mr. Vance nodded politely, offering no emotional reaction to her arrogant tone. He carefully lifted the emerald choker from the velvet, adjusting a bright halogen lamp over his appraisal mat. He pulled a jeweler's loop from his breast pocket and fixed it to his right eye. Beatrice crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently against the thick carpet. "My late husband purchased that ruby in Geneva," she boasted desperately, trying to maintain her illusion of superiority. "The diamonds were cut specifically for my mother-in-law. You are holding the financial legacy of the most powerful family in this city. Please hurry, I have urgent meetings to attend." Mr. Vance did not respond. He set the emerald choker down and picked up the ruby ring. He turned it slowly under the harsh light. He picked up an electronic diamond tester, pressing the metal tip against several of the stones on the tennis bracelets. The machine emitted a flat, dull beep. He frowned slightly, putting the tester aside. He reached for a small bottle of testing acid and a scratch stone, running the metal clasp of the necklace against the abrasive surface. After exactly 4 minutes of silent, agonizing scrutiny, Mr. Vance removed his loop and placed his hands flat on the glass table. He looked at Beatrice with an expression of profound professional pity. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began, his voice perfectly level, "I am afraid I cannot offer you a cash loan today, or any day." Beatrice scoffed loudly, her eyes flashing with indignant rage. "What kind of establishment is this? Are you incapable of providing a simple $500,000 loan for items worth 10 times that amount? If you lack the capital, simply tell me and I will take my business to someone competent." "We possess more than enough capital," Mr. Vance replied calmly. "The issue is your collateral. These pieces are completely worthless." Beatrice froze. The blood drained entirely from her face. "I beg your pardon?" she hissed, leaning forward. "These are replicas," Mr. Vance stated, pushing the mahogany box back across the table. "They are exceptionally well-crafted replicas, I will admit. The settings are sterling silver, heavily plated in gold and rhodium. The stones are high-grade cubic zirconia, synthetic sapphires, and laboratory-grown green spinel. The ruby is actually colored lead glass. The entire box combined might fetch $2,000 at a theatrical costume auction. They hold absolutely no estate value." Beatrice shot up from her chair, her hand slamming down onto the glass table. "You are lying!" she screamed, her aristocratic facade shattering into a million jagged pieces. "You are a fraud. These are the Blackwood diamonds. I have worn them to galas for 30 years. My son personally had them cleaned and appraised for insurance purposes just last year. You are trying to steal from me." Mr. Vance remained perfectly seated, pressing a hidden button under his desk. "I assure you, ma'am, I am an expert. Someone has swapped your genuine stones for paste. You have been walking around wearing glass." The heavy security door to the private appraisal room buzzed loudly, unlocking with a heavy metallic clack. Beatrice spun around, fully expecting security to throw her out. Instead, she found me standing in the doorway. I was wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly relaxed. In my left hand, I held a heavy, fireproof steel lockbox, the same lockbox Trent had kept hidden in the deepest corner of his private office safe. Beatrice stared at me, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with a mixture of hatred and absolute panic. Clara, she spat, her voice trembling with raw venom. Are you following me? Are you behind this? Did you pay this man to humiliate me? I walked slowly into the room, bypassing Beatrice entirely, and placed the steel lockbox directly on Mr. Vance's glass table. I looked at the pathetic mahogany box filled with shiny glass, then looked up at Beatrice. I did not pay him anything, Beatrice. I said, my voice eerily calm. He is just doing his job. He is completely right. You have been wearing worthless trash for the last 4 years. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small silver key, and unlocked the steel box. I pushed the heavy lid open, revealing a blinding, brilliant array of authentic glittering gemstones. The real Blackwood emerald choker. The real diamond bracelets. The real ruby ring. They caught the halogen light and refracted it across the room in a dazzling display of actual wealth. Beatrice gasped, stumbling backward until she hit the wall. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes darting between the fake jewelry in her box and the genuine artifacts sitting in mine. Trent needed massive amounts of liquid cash to fund his offshore shell companies and keep Sienna completely silent, I explained, watching the devastating truth sink into Beatrice's mind. He could not drain the corporate accounts fast enough, so he went after the family assets. 4 years ago, your precious son took your beloved heirlooms, had identical fakes manufactured, and quietly swapped them out while you were hosting a garden party. He locked the real pieces inside a private safe deposit box registered under a dummy corporation. Beatrice began to shake her head frantically, refusing to accept the reality that her own golden child had robbed her blind. No, she whimpered, sliding down the wall until she hit the floor. Trent would never do that to me. He loves me. He respects our legacy. He respected nothing but his own survival, I corrected coldly. During the forensic audit of his hidden assets, I uncovered the dummy corporation holding the safety deposit box. As the newly appointed majority shareholder and the legal executor of the asset division mandated by the federal court, I legally seized the contents yesterday afternoon. I picked up the heavy, authentic diamond tennis bracelet, letting it catch the light, before dropping it carelessly back into the steel box. These belong to the holding company now, I stated, staring down at the broken, weeping woman on the floor. You have absolutely nothing left to sell, Beatrice. Your jewelry is fake, your son is a thief, and your entire legacy is a complete illusion. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the federal courthouse was a harsh departure from the warm golden glow of the high-end pawn shop. 2 weeks had passed since Beatrice collapsed on that showroom floor, and the Blackwood family's empire had officially been reduced to a pile of federal indictments and seized assets. I sat in the front row of the gallery wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, my posture impeccable. I was not here as a defendant. I was here as the primary witness for the prosecution, and I had the best seat in the house to watch Trent's final desperate performance. Trent took the stand looking entirely unrecognizable. The bespoke Italian suits and imported silk ties were gone, seized along with his offshore accounts. In their place, he wore a shiny, ill-fitting gray polyester suit provided by his court-appointed public defender. His usually immaculate hair hung limply over his forehead, and his skin carried the sickly grayish pallor of a man who had not slept soundly since the FBI raided his estate. Yet despite his pathetic appearance, Trent still believed he could charm his way out of a federal conviction. As his sleazy, overworked public defender guided him through his direct testimony, Trent masterfully played the role of the victim. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. I never wanted any of this, Trent told the jury, forcing a remarkably convincing tremor into his voice. I am just a businessman. I trusted my wife. I trusted Clara with my entire life. But when our marriage began to struggle, she became completely unhinged. She could not handle the idea of me finding happiness elsewhere. She is a brilliant woman, highly skilled with computers and financial software. She hacked my private accounts, routed corporate funds without my knowledge, and meticulously framed me out of pure vindictive spite. I am innocent. My only crime was marrying a deeply unstable woman. He actually managed to squeeze a single pathetic tear from his eye, wiping it away with the back of his hand. Several jurors leaned forward, their expressions softening with misplaced sympathy. It was a beautiful piece of amateur theater. Unfortunately for Trent, federal prosecutors do not deal in theater. They deal in digital footprints. The lead prosecutor, a razor-sharp litigator named Harrison, who moved with the predatory grace of a great white shark, approached the podium. He did not yell. He did not posture. He simply tapped a button on his remote, and the massive projector screen behind the witness stand flickered to life. Mr. Blackwood Harrison began, his voice echoing coldly across the silent courtroom. You claim your ex-wife hacked your systems and forged the divorce documents to seize your assets. Let us look at the metadata for those specific files, shall we? The screen illuminated with a complex web of digital timestamps, IP addresses, and routing logs. Trent's fake sorrow instantly vanished, replaced by a rigid, wide-eyed panic. He gripped the edges of the witness box so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. This is the digital signature attached to the forged divorce decree, Harrison announced, pointing a red laser at the screen. The document was created, signed, and encrypted on a laptop, with an IP address registered directly to your private penthouse suite at the Four Seasons. Furthermore, the keystroke logs show the document was finalized at exactly 2:14 in the morning on October 12th. According to your own sworn deposition, your ex-wife was attending a marketing conference in Chicago on that exact date. Did she magically project her hands across state lines to type on your personal computer, Mr. Blackwood? Trent swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. I cannot explain the technical details. She must have used a proxy server. She is very devious. Harrison smiled, a terrifying, humorless expression. Devious indeed. Let us move to the offshore shell companies. You claim she routed the embezzled corporate pension funds to the Cayman Islands without your knowledge. Harrison tapped his remote again. A new document appeared on the screen bearing the official seal of an international banking conglomerate. These accounts require maximum security clearance for any transfer exceeding $1 million, Harrison explained, turning to face the jury. They do not just require a password. They require biometric authorization, specifically a retinal scan and a live randomized voice print confirmation. We have the audio files of you authorizing every single transfer, Mr. Blackwood. Unless you are suggesting your ex-wife somehow removed your eyeballs and perfectly mimicked your vocal cords, while simultaneously being out of state, your victim narrative is completely physically impossible. Soft gasps rippled through the gallery. The jurors who had looked sympathetic moments earlier were now glaring at Trent with absolute disgust. Trent was physically sinking into his chair, shrinking under the harsh, unforgiving light of irrefutable evidence. He looked toward his public defender, silently pleading for an objection, but the lawyer was aggressively studying his legal pad, pretending not to notice his client's public execution. We are not finished, Harrison said softly, walking directly up to the witness box. Because beyond the biometric data, we also subpoenaed the cloud backups of your personal cell phone, the same phone you used to communicate with your mistress, Sienna Vance. The screen changed one final time. A series of text message bubbles appeared, blown up to massive proportions for the entire courtroom to read. Harrison adjusted his glasses and read the texts aloud, ensuring every single word hung heavily in the air. Quote from Trenton Blackwood. The old bat is totally clueless. I moved the last $5 million from the employee pension fund today. Clara thinks I am at a board meeting. I will wire the cash to your offshore account by midnight. Go buy that diamond tennis bracelet you wanted. End quote. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked murmurs and angry whispers. The judge struck his gavel sharply, demanding order, but the damage was irreversible. Trent's defense was completely annihilated. The arrogant CEO, the master manipulator, had been thoroughly exposed as a sloppy, greedy fraud who had documented his own federal crimes in high definition. I sat perfectly still, my face entirely impassive, watching Trent hyperventilate on the stand. He was completely out of options. His lies had trapped him in a concrete box, and the prosecution had just welded the door shut. But a cornered rat is always at its most dangerous. Trent's public defender suddenly stood up. The man looked incredibly nervous, sweating through his cheap collar, but he clutched a fresh piece of paper in his hand like a lifeline. He knew the forensic evidence was unbeatable, so he opted for a desperate, chaotic distraction. Your Honor, The defense requests permission to call a rebuttal witness to the stand, the lawyer announced, his voice echoing over the lingering whispers in the gallery. We call Sienna Vance. I stiffened slightly, my eyes narrowing. Sienna had vanished the morning the FBI raided the estate. She had no money, no powerful allies, and her pristine reputation was entirely destroyed. There was absolutely no logical reason for her to step into a federal courtroom unless she had been given a massive, overwhelming incentive. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Sienna walked down the center aisle, her posture rigid, her eyes cast downward. She was not wearing her usual designer maternity wear. She wore a simple, modest gray dress, looking every bit the terrified, coerced victim. As she walked past my row, she did not look at me, but I saw the subtle, calculating glint in her eyes. Trent must have had one final hidden reserve of cash stashed somewhere off the books. He had liquidated his absolute last lifeline to buy her testimony. Sienna took the oath and sat in the witness box, gripping the microphone with trembling hands. Miss Vance, the public defender, asked, pacing in front of the jury box. You were intimately involved with my client, Trenton Blackwood, but I want to ask you about his ex-wife, who actually approached you with the plan to drain the corporate pension funds and frame Mr. Blackwood. Sienna looked up. She bypassed the prosecutor. She bypassed the judge. She pointed a perfectly manicured, trembling finger directly at me. It was Clara, Sienna stated, her voice echoing through the stunned courtroom. She approached me 6 months ago. She paid me to seduce Trent. She planned the entire embezzlement scheme to destroy the Blackwood family and seize absolute control of the company. Trent is innocent. Clara is the mastermind. The courtroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked gasps and frantic whispering. Sienna leaned closer to the microphone, her posture perfectly mimicking that of a terrified, manipulated victim. She let a single flawlessly timed tear roll down her pale cheek. She testified that I had approached her at a charity gala 6 months ago, handing her a burner phone and a detailed script. She claimed I offered her millions to seduce Trent, distract him, and grant me access to his private corporate servers. According to her completely fabricated narrative, I was the one who initiated the illegal wire transfers, entirely intent on framing my husband so I could seize absolute control of Apex Guardian. At the defense table, Trent nodded vigorously, his chest puffing out with renewed arrogant confidence. He shot me a smug, vindictive glare across the room. His sleazy public defender looked triumphant, believing he had just successfully introduced reasonable doubt into an otherwise airtight federal prosecution. A few rows behind me in the gallery, Beatrice let out a loud theatrical sigh of relief, loud enough for the jury to hear. I did not blink. I did not shift in my seat. I did not offer them the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I calmly unzipped my leather briefcase. I reached inside and retrieved a slim, matte black tablet. The device was already unlocked, the screen glowing brightly with the results of a real-time financial trace I had initiated the moment Sienna walked through the courtroom doors. I leaned slightly over the low wooden partition separating the gallery from the prosecution table and tapped Harrison on the shoulder. The shark-like federal prosecutor turned his head. I slid the tablet directly into his hand, locking eyes with him. I gave him a single definitive nod. Harrison glanced down at the glowing screen. His eyes widened slightly before a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. Your witness, Mr. Harrison, the judge announced, slamming his gavel to quiet the lingering murmurs in the gallery. Harrison stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate, agonizing slowness. He did not carry a notepad. He simply held my tablet as he strolled toward the center of the courtroom. Miss Vance, Harrison began, his voice dangerously soft. That was an incredibly compelling story. You painted a vivid picture of yourself as a destitute, coerced pawn in a grand corporate conspiracy. You claim you are broke, ruined, and testifying today simply to clear your conscience. Is that correct? Yes, Sienna whispered, clutching a tissue and dabbing at her eyes. I lost everything. I have absolutely no money left. I am just trying to tell the truth. Harrison connected the tablet wirelessly to the courtroom's central projector. The massive screen behind the witness box flickered to life. It is fascinating that you claim to be destitute, Miss Vance Harrison said, his voice rising in volume and authority. Because according to the International Banking Grid, your personal wealth increased exponentially just a few hours ago. Sienna froze. The tissue dropped from her hand, fluttering onto the wooden ledge of the witness box. Her manufactured tears instantly stopped. The projector screen displayed a high-resolution bank statement, complete with digital security watermarks. "Let us review this transaction," Harrison commanded, pointing sharply at the screen. At exactly 3:14 this morning, a highly encrypted wire transfer was initiated from a cryptocurrency wallet routed through the Cayman Islands. The amount was exactly $250,000. The receiving account is a private offshore holding fund registered under your maiden name, Sienna Miller. Trent slumped back in his chair, all the color draining from his face. His public defender scrambled to his feet, shouting an objection about unverified evidence, but the judge brutally waved him down, demanding Harrison continue. "We ran a real-time forensic trace on the origin of that crypto wallet," Harrison stated, turning to face the jury. "The wallet belongs to a shell company created by Trenton Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood used a smuggled contraband cell phone inside his federal holding cell last night to liquidate his absolute final hidden asset. He wired $250,000 directly to you, Miss Vance, precisely 5 hours before you walked into this courtroom to deliver this miraculous exculpatory testimony." Sienna's jaw dropped. She looked frantically at the screen, then at Trent, her eyes wide with sheer, unfiltered panic. She gripped the microphone stand, her knuckles turning white, but no words came out. The trap had snapped shut with terrifying speed. "You were paid for your perjury!" Harrison roared, his voice echoing like thunder against the marble walls. "You accepted $250,000 in stolen funds to sit in a federal court and lie under oath." Before Sienna could attempt to stammer out a defense, the judge leaned entirely over his elevated bench. His face was thunderous, his eyes glaring down at the witness box with absolute uncompromising fury. "Miss Vance," the judge interrupted, his voice booming with judicial authority, "let me make your current situation crystal clear. You are currently under oath in a federal criminal proceeding. Perjury in this court is a felony offense. If you continue with this fabricated testimony, I will have the bailiff place you in handcuffs the second you step down from that stand. You will be charged with perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit federal fraud. You will give birth in a federal penitentiary, and you will serve decades behind bars. I will ask you one final time, and I strongly advise you to consider your own survival. Who orchestrated this embezzlement scheme?" Sienna looked at the judge. She looked at the federal agents standing by the doors. She looked at Trent, who was violently shaking his head silently, begging her to hold the line. Then Sienna looked past Trent. Her panicked, terrified eyes locked directly onto Beatrice Blackwood, who was sitting in the gallery clutching her fake pearls in absolute terror. Sienna snapped. The pressure, the fear of federal prison, and the realization that Trent was completely powerless finally broke her. It was not Trent. Sienna screamed, her voice shrill and echoing wildly through the stunned courtroom. She pointed a shaking, desperate finger directly at the gallery. "Trent is too stupid to pull this off. It was her. It was Beatrice. She orchestrated the entire thing. She ordered Trent to steal the pension funds to save the estate. It was all Beatrice's idea." The courtroom plunged into absolute chaos. Beatrice leaped to her feet, her face contorted in a mask of aristocratic outrage. "You lying, wretched little gold digger!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Sienna. "I never spoke a single word to you. You are nothing but a common homewrecker trying to save your own pathetic skin." But Trent, cornered and desperate, saw a tiny sliver of daylight. His survival instincts kicked in, overriding any residual loyalty to his mother. He lunged forward against the wooden railing of the defendant's table. "She is telling the truth," Trent yelled, his voice echoing above the din. "It was my mother. She forced me to do it. The estate was bleeding money, and she said we had a legacy to protect. She handed me the offshore routing numbers. She told me the employees would never notice the missing pension funds." Beatrice spun toward her son, her eyes bulging with sheer, unadulterated disbelief. the regal facade she had maintained for 4 decades completely vaporized. "How dare you!" she roared, her voice shrill and unhinged. "I gave you everything, Trenton. I covered up your massive incompetence for years. You were running Apex Guardian directly into the ground with your idiotic investments and your exorbitant lifestyle. You came crying to me when the auditors started asking questions. You told me to frame Clara." Trent fired back, his face turning a mottled shade of crimson. "You said Clara was entirely expendable. You said she was just a commoner who got lucky marrying into our family and that no judge would ever believe her over the Blackwood name. Because you were too weak to handle her yourself," Beatrice shrieked, completely abandoning any pretense of innocence. She marched toward the low wooden barrier separating the gallery from the well of the court. Federal marshals immediately stepped forward, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. "You sniveling coward. I had to manage the board of directors. I had to bribe Richard Sterling to keep him quiet. I did all the heavy lifting while you were busy buying diamonds for your pregnant mistress using stolen employee retirement money." Trent's public defender buried his face in his hands completely, giving up any attempt to control his client. Harrison, the federal prosecutor, simply stepped back from the podium. He crossed his arms and watched the implosion with profound professional satisfaction. I remained perfectly still in the front row of the gallery. I did not smile. I did not flinch. I sat with my back completely straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap, breathing in the sweet, intoxicating air of total vindication. For years, these two people had gaslit me, manipulated me, and treated me like disposable collateral. They had built an arrogant empire on lies, utterly convinced that their bloodline made them untouchable. Now stripped of their wealth and facing the terrifying reality of federal prison, the thin veneer of family loyalty had dissolved instantly. They were tearing each other to shreds, confessing to multiple federal felonies on the public record, desperately trying to shift the blame to save themselves. I did not have to say a single word. I simply let their inherent toxic selfishness do all the heavy lifting. "I only bribed Sterling because you completely messed up the wire transfers," Trent yelled, spittle flying from his lips. "You are the one who hired the hacker to plant the false divorce decrees on Clara's laptop. You paid him in untraceable bearer bonds, which I had to sell my authentic jewelry to cover because you replaced my family heirlooms with cheap glass." Beatrice shrieked back, her voice cracking under the intense strain. "You stole from your own mother. You are a massive disgrace to the Blackwood name." "There is no Blackwood name left," Trent screamed. "Clara took everything." The presiding judge had finally reached his absolute limit. His face was a mask of unyielding judicial fury. He raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down on the sounding block with the force of a gunshot. The sharp, explosive crack echoed through the courtroom, instantly silencing the vicious, screaming match. "That is enough," the judge roared, his voice booming through the surround sound system. "Bailiffs, restrain the defendant and place that woman in the gallery in handcuffs immediately." 3 federal marshals descended on Beatrice. She shrieked in loud protest as they grabbed her arms, forcing them firmly behind her back and snapping heavy steel cuffs around her wrists. "Unhand me," she demanded, struggling uselessly against the highly trained officers. "I am Beatrice Blackwood. You cannot do this to me. You are currently under arrest for contempt of court, conspiracy to commit federal fraud, and witness tampering," the judge stated coldly, staring down at her from the elevated bench. "And you, Mr. Blackwood, have just confessed to orchestrating a massive corporate embezzlement scheme and framing an innocent woman. You are both being held without bail." Trent sank heavily into his chair, his hands trembling violently as a federal marshal stood directly behind him, resting a heavy, authoritative hand on his shoulder. Sienna sat frozen in the witness box, sobbing silently, realizing her own immunity deal was likely entirely voided by her initial perjury. The judge adjusted his robes and looked down at his digital ledger. Given the extraordinary confessions delivered spontaneously in this courtroom today, the financial trajectory of this case is completely clear. The injunction against Clara Blackwood is permanently dissolved. Furthermore, I am signing an immediate comprehensive restitution order. Every single seized asset, real estate holding, and liquidated offshore account currently belonging to Trenton and Beatrice Blackwood is hereby permanently transferred to Clara Blackwood. These funds will be used to fully restore the Apex Guardian Employee Pension Fund. Any remaining balance will serve as direct punitive damages for the severe emotional and financial distress inflicted upon her. The judge raised his gavel one last time, his eyes locking coldly onto Trent's terrified face. Trenton Blackwood, the judge, pronounced, his voice carrying the heavy, inescapable weight of absolute justice. You have sat in this courtroom and attempted to manipulate the very fabric of the federal legal system. You have stolen from hardworking employees, defrauded your own corporate board, and maliciously attempted to frame an innocent woman to cover your own exorbitant greed. Your complete lack of remorse is staggering, and your willingness to commit perjury in my courtroom is a profound insult to the rule of law. Trent visibly recoiled, pressing himself so far back into his chair it looked as though he were trying to merge with the varnished wood. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. He looked absolutely nothing like the untouchable corporate titan he had pretended to be for the past 10 years. He was just a terrified, broken man waiting for the executioner's blade to fall. For the charges of massive corporate wire fraud, embezzlement of employee pension funds, conspiracy to commit federal fraud, and witness tampering? The judge continued, never breaking his icy stare. I sentence you to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. This sentence is to be served consecutively, without the possibility of early parole. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. 25 years. Trent would be an old, forgotten man by the time he ever saw the outside of a concrete box. He let out a strangled, pathetic whimper, wrapping his arms around his own stomach as if he had been physically gutted. Furthermore, the judge added, raising his voice to cut through the rising murmurs of the crowd, this court recognizes the profound financial devastation you have inflicted upon Apex Guardian and Clara Blackwood. I am ordering immediate and total restitution. You are hereby ordered to pay $85 million in damages. Every single asset registered to your name, including your vehicles, real estate holdings, private equity shares, and personal luxury items, is permanently forfeited to the federal government to satisfy this debt. You are completely and officially bankrupt, Mr. Blackwood. You leave this courtroom with absolutely nothing. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the sounding block with the deafening crack of a rifle shot. The sound signaled the absolute, undeniable end of the Blackwood empire. I remained perfectly still in the front row, absorbing the magnitude of the moment. I had not just beaten him. I had legally, systematically, and completely erased him. My gaze drifted away from Trent's sobbing form and swept across the crowded gallery. I was looking for one specific person. I found him standing near the heavy oak double doors at the back of the courtroom. Jamal. Trent's former high-priced defense attorney had slipped into the gallery halfway through the proceedings, likely hoping to quietly observe the fallout and assess his own level of collateral damage. He stood with his arms crossed, wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit, looking incredibly tense but mostly relieved. He honestly believed he had escaped the blast radius. He believed that by refusing to represent Trent today, he had successfully shielded himself from the federal fallout. He was entirely wrong. I watched him reach into his breast pocket. He pulled out his sleek smartphone, his brow furrowing as the screen lit up with an urgent notification. I knew exactly what that notification was. I had timed it perfectly. The encrypted email containing every forged document, every illegal wire transfer log, and every single piece of blackmail material Jamal had ever drafted for the Blackwood family had been securely transmitted to the disciplinary committee of the State Bar Association, exactly as I had promised. From my seat at the front of the courtroom, I watched the arrogant, untouchable lawyer transform into a terrified amateur. Jamal's eyes darted rapidly back and forth across his illuminated screen as he read the subject line of the emergency email. His license to practice law had just been officially and instantly suspended, pending a mandatory disbarment hearing. His entire career, built on a foundation of shady deals, client manipulation, and corporate blackmail, was over. He was facing total professional ruin and highly probable criminal charges of his own. Jamal's head snapped up. His eyes frantically scanned the courtroom gallery until they locked directly onto mine. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He gripped his phone so tightly I thought the screen might shatter in his palm. I did not look away. I leaned slightly back in my chair, tilted my head, and offered him a slow, cold, utterly victorious smirk. I had promised him I would not send the evidence that specific night. I never promised I would delete it. I watched his shoulders slump in utter defeat before he turned and shoved his way out the heavy courtroom doors, disappearing into the hallway to face his inevitable downfall. My attention snapped back to the front of the room as a sudden burst of chaotic shouting erupted. Two heavily armed federal marshals were forcefully dragging Beatrice Blackwood down the center aisle. She was kicking, thrashing, and screaming obscenities at the top of her lungs, her designer heels scraping aggressively against the polished marble floor. Her pearl necklace had snapped during the struggle, sending little white beads scattering across the courtroom. She looked completely unhinged, her aristocratic dignity replaced by the rabid desperation of a cornered animal. "Do not touch me!" Beatrice shrieked, fighting wildly against the steel handcuffs cutting into her wrists. "I am a Blackwood. You work for me. I demand to speak to the governor. I will have all of your jobs." The marshals ignored her entirely, hauling her forcefully through the exit doors and out of sight. At the defendant's table, two different bailiffs stepped forward to take Trent into custody. One officer grabbed Trent's right arm, pulling him upward to secure the heavy steel chains around his wrists. But Trent was completely blinded by panic. The reality of his absolute ruin, the loss of his wealth, his mother's arrest, and the terrifying prospect of 25 years in a federal cage finally broke his mind. He snapped. As the bailiff reached for his left arm, Trent violently shoved the officer backward. The sudden, desperate burst of adrenaline caught the armed guards completely by surprise. Trent lunged forward, scrambling wildly over the low wooden partition that separated the defense tables from the gallery. He hit the carpeted floor hard, his cheap polyester suit tearing at the knee. He did not try to run for the exit. He did not try to fight the guards. Instead, he scrambled frantically across the floor on his hands and knees, crawling directly toward the front row. He stopped right at my feet. Before the recovering bailiffs could tackle him to the ground, Trent reached out with trembling, sweaty hands and grabbed the hem of my tailored suit jacket. Tears streamed down his pale, grayish face, mixing with the sweat beading on his forehead. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and pleading, completely stripped of his former arrogance. "Clara, please!" Trent sobbed hysterically, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch as he buried his face against my knees. "Please, I am begging you. Do not let them take me. I am so sorry. I was wrong about everything. I love you, Clara. I have always loved you. I can fix this. Just tell the judge you forgive me. Please, Clara, just give me a second chance." I stared down at the trembling, pathetic shell of a man clutching the fabric of my skirt. Trent's tears soaked into the wool blend of my suit, his shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrolled sobs. He babbled incoherently about love, about mistakes, about starting over. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as the former golden boy of the Blackwood dynasty reduced himself to a groveling mess on the federal courthouse floor. A year ago, seeing him like this would have broken my heart. I would have felt the innate, foolish urge to comfort him, to fix his mistakes, to shield him from the consequences of his own arrogance. I would have believed the desperate lies spilling from his mouth. Today I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, no residual affection. The space in my chest where my love for Trenton Blackwood used to reside was completely hollow, replaced by the cold, sterile certainty of justice. I did not pull away. I did not scream or curse at him. I simply let him weep, allowing the gallery, the judge, and the federal marshals to witness the total evaporation of his dignity. Trent looked up, his face slick with sweat and tears, his eyes searching mine for any sign of mercy. "Clara, please," he gasped, his fingers digging into my knees. "I can be better. We can be a family again." I slowly leaned forward until my face was only inches from his. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper meant only for him. "You called me an IT nobody, Trent," I whispered, watching the terror multiply in his bloodshot eyes. "You said I was a disposable commoner. But the nobody just bought your entire life. Trent froze. The breath hitched in his throat, his jaw trembling as the absolute finality of my words sank in. He realized in that singular moment that there was no manipulation left to deploy. The game was over, and I held all the pieces. I straightened up, smoothing the front of my jacket with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I looked past Trent's kneeling form and caught the eye of the lead federal bailiff. I gave a single, sharp nod. The bailiffs lunged forward. They hauled Trent off the floor by his armpits, dragging him backward as he began to thrash and scream all over again. He shouted my name, his voice echoing off the marble walls, growing fainter as the heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind him. The Blackwood legacy had officially ended in handcuffs and hysterics. Prosecutor Harrison approached the wooden partition, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He handed me back my matte black tablet. "A flawless execution, Clara," he said quietly. "The Blackwood estate assets are already being seized by federal agents. The title transfers to your name will be processed by the end of the business day." "Thank you, Harrison," I replied, sliding the tablet securely into my leather briefcase. I turned and walked out of the courtroom. The heavy double doors opened into a chaotic hallway, packed with frantic reporters, blinding camera flashes, and aggressive microphones shoved in my direction. They shouted questions about the Blackwood downfall, the stolen pensions, and my sudden acquisition of an $85 million corporate empire. I ignored them all. I kept my head high, my posture impeccable, walking directly through the media circus until I reached the waiting black SUV idling at the curb. I slid into the plush leather back seat and closed the door, instantly shutting out the noise of the world. I opened my tablet and pulled up the primary banking dashboard for Apex Guardian. The federal injunctions had cleared. Absolute administrative control belonged solely to me. My very first executive order was swift and merciless. I initiated a massive sweeping wire transfer, moving millions from the seized offshore accounts directly back into the Apex Guardian Employee Pension Fund. I restored every single stolen dollar, adding a 20% compound interest bonus to every employee account to compensate for the distress Trent and Beatrice had caused. My second order was terminating the entire board of directors. Every corrupt executive who had enabled Beatrice, every sycophant who had looked the other way while Trent looted the company, received an immediate non-negotiable termination notice without severance. I dismantled the toxic corporate structure, brick by brick, burning the corrupt Blackwood hierarchy to the ground, so I could build something entirely new. For the next 6 months, I worked relentlessly. I rebranded the company, installed aggressive internal audits, and restored public trust in the firm. Apex Guardian became Apex Solutions, a technology security firm that actually protected its clients rather than exploiting them. My bank accounts swelled, my reputation in the corporate sector became bulletproof, and my former in-laws settled into their bleak, highly regulated routines in maximum security federal prison. I had won. I had survived the fire and forged an empire from the ashes. I had everything I ever wanted. But there was still one loose end, one final ghost from the past that required my personal attention. 6 months passed. The high-rise boardrooms of Boston faded away, replaced by the relentless driving rain of the Pacific Northwest. We transitioned to a dingy diner on the outskirts of Seattle. The neon sign above the entrance flickered erratically, casting a sickly red glow across the flooded asphalt parking lot. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, burnt frying oil, and damp wool. The linoleum floors were sticky, the vinyl booths were cracked and patched with silver duct tape, and the lone waitress behind the counter looked as exhausted as the peeling wallpaper. A figure sat alone in the furthest corner booth, huddled over a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee, watching the rain lash violently against the grimy window pane. The bell above the diner door jingled sharply, momentarily pulling the solitary figure's attention away from the storm. But it was not me sitting in that gloomy booth. I had just arrived. Before I even pushed open the heavy glass door, I paused under the awning and looked across the flooded street. Through the driving rain, I spotted a familiar face standing outside a cheap discount retail store. It was Sienna. She was wearing a bright green, oversized polyester uniform vest, arguing aggressively and pointing a frantic finger at a tired-looking store manager. I watched as the manager simply shook his head, snatched her plastic name tag right out of her hand, and locked the sliding glass door squarely in her face. Sienna kicked the metal door frame in a fit of useless rage, her shoulders slumping in total defeat. She had just been fired from a minimum wage job. There were no million-dollar wire transfers coming to save her now. She was completely trapped in the miserable reality she had earned. I turned away from the pathetic display and stepped into the diner. I shook the worst of the rain from my custom-tailored cashmere coat, the pristine charcoal fabric standing in stark, almost absurd contrast to the cracked vinyl booths and the sticky linoleum floors. I walked deliberately to the front counter, taking a seat on a wobbly chrome stool. The tired waitress working the register kept her back to me, aggressively scrubbing a burnt coffee pot with a steel wool sponge. Her shoulders were hunched, her graying hair tied back in a messy, grease-stained hairnet. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice smooth and perfectly projected over the sizzling grill. "I will take a simple black coffee." The waitress stiffened. The steel wool dropped from her raw, unmanicured hands, clattering loudly into the aluminum sink. She turned around with agonizing slowness. Beatrice Blackwood's eyes widened in sheer absolute horror. The former matriarch of Boston High Society was wearing a hideous mustard yellow uniform, a stained white apron tied haphazardly around her waist. The heavy gold jewelry and custom pearls were completely gone, replaced by a cheap plastic name tag that simply read, B. After federal prosecutors seized her assets and the judge handed her a suspended sentence with crippling financial penalties and mandatory community labor, she had fled across the country to hide her shame. But I always knew exactly where to find her. We stared at each other across the sticky laminate counter. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed silently. The arrogant fire that used to burn in her eyes was completely extinguished. She looked utterly broken. She reached for a cheap ceramic mug, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. She filled it with burnt, sludgy coffee from the carafe and slid it across the counter toward me, refusing to meet my gaze. She did not say a single word. The utter humiliation of serving the woman she had tried to destroy had finally silenced her forever. I picked up the mug, taking a single performative sip. I placed it back on the saucer, then reached into my designer handbag. I retrieved a crisp, newly minted $100 bill and placed it flat on the counter. Beside it, I set a small, heavy stock business card with a handwritten note on the back. I stood up, buttoning my coat with effortless grace. "Keep the change," I said, my voice devoid of any pity. "I hear court fees are expensive." I turned and walked out the door, the bell jingling behind me. I did not look back. I knew she would snatch the card the second I left. I stepped into my waiting town car, leaving the ghosts of the Blackwood Empire to rot in the rainy gutters where they belonged. The gray, depressing skies of Seattle dissolved, replaced by the brilliant, blinding sunshine streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corner office. The grand opening of the Apex Cyber Forensics headquarters was the premier corporate event of the entire season. The sprawling state-of-the-art facility occupied the top 3 floors of the most expensive commercial high-rise in downtown Boston. The main atrium downstairs was currently packed with industry leaders, elite tech innovators, and top-tier global investors. They were all there to celebrate the launch of an untouchable security empire. I had stood at the main podium earlier that evening, announcing the establishment of a massive, fully funded grant program, specifically designed for young women entering the tech and forensic accounting fields. I was ensuring that the next generation of female innovators would never have to fight for their financial independence the way I had. They would have the absolute resources, the elite backing, and the structural power to build their own empires without ever relying on toxic corporate gatekeepers. Now I stood entirely alone by the expansive glass window of my private executive suite, looking out over the glittering city skyline. The sophisticated jazz music and the lively noise of the gala echoed faintly through the thick mahogany doors. I held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip. I turned toward my massive obsidian desk. Resting exactly in the center, catching the warm afternoon light, was a simple silver frame photograph of my grandfather. He was smiling in the picture, his eyes full of the same fierce, uncompromising determination that had fueled my survival through the darkest months of my life. The $50 million inheritance he had hidden for me was completely safe. More than safe, it had been strategically multiplied, completely secured behind layers of impenetrable corporate armor and legal trusts. I had taken the ultimate betrayal, the absolute worst destruction the Blackwood family could throw at me, and I had weaponized it. I turned their staggering arrogance into my operational capital. I turned their vicious crimes into my unshakable foundation. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer the expendable wife meant to be discarded in the shadows. I was Clara, and I had built an untouchable empire.